Hello, everybody. My name is Ian Kirkpatrick. I'm an author, idiot, and loin streamer, and today we're going to be talking about The Dark Creator by Lauren Chambers. This is the third book in the Dark Descendants series, where I am told there are going to be 5 books. I currently have The Dark Butler, which just came out on January 24th. That is on my list to read. I have to look at what my schedule looks like for reading and when it's going to come up. However, we are reading. I am interested in these worlds and these ideas and talking about the stories that are created. And yeah. But before we get into more of the gritties and specifics of this book, number 1, if you enjoy what I do here on the channel, please remember to like, share, and subscribe for more. Number 2, if you would like to be featured on the channel, check out the links down in the description below. The number 1 way to be featured is through Lamoy, the monthly prompt writing contest where I give you a prompt. You write a short story using that prompt, and on the first Monday video of the month, we bask in your creativity. The second way to be featured is if you are an indie author and you have a book out or a book that is coming out. If you submit it to the Fresh Meat feature, that first chapter and the cover will be read here on the channel to hopefully help more readers find your work. You could end up being the feature just like this, which, there are many books that come from me interacting with the authors on this channel or, knowing of the authors. And mileage may vary. There's also, if you're interested in me doing a full review or discussion of your book like this one or the others on this channel, there is a link on the link tree to submit your book, and in the summer I will be selecting books from there. Just familiarize yourself with the way that I do things and mentally prepare yourselves. The third thing is, if you would like to check out any of my books, they're available at any of your favorite places to get books, including the local library upon request. My newest novel, Bodymore Zero, came out in October of last year, featuring these 2 gentlemen right here. Is a prequel that can be read without reading the rest of the Bodymore series. And my newest project will be the Legend of Bill Cassidy, Book 1, coming out in November. More information coming with that, hopefully with a cover. I want to start sharing stuff with that as soon as possible. So with that said, let's jump into the introduction to this book. So I went into this book hopeful because I had just come off of reading Dark Scientist. Well, I had actually finished reading Hapless Homesteader and then went into this one. But I was still thinking about the Dark Scientist. And even to this moment, I am still thinking about the Dark Scientist. And then I got kind of irritated reading this book because it was so messy. It was so much a letdown compared to what I had experienced in The Dark Scientist. And there were messy parts of The Dark Scientist, don't get me wrong. But I found things that I really liked in the trajectory of the way that it was built, in the character actions, the character motivations made sense for the most part. Stacy and the random serial killer guy aside. And this just didn't have it. I don't know. It made me retroactively be like, wait a second, did I insert that much into The Dark Scientist to make it that much more enjoyable? And I started thinking about if I enjoyed the other book, just if I had to lower my rating on the other book, because this one was such a yikes for me. And I did for a little bit, but then I continued to think about The Dark Scientist and how much I enjoyed the way that it was and it's probably the tropes. I like the idea a lot. And since I was still thinking about it, then I figured, okay, I will put that back and I will just recognize that this story was not for me. This story also reminded me of Bringer of Light, but that might be because this involved clones and that also involved clones. And I'm starting to realize that I may just not like the trope of clones or how often clones are used to create a society of I'm going to become God. Because I won't lie, I have a character that I started designing years ago who is a character, who is a clone made by the government to be a soldier. Not that unique. So I do have a clone in my back pocket somewhere, but that story never developed. So I never want to say never to clones, but I do think clone plus God complex might not be a trope for me. If you go into this looking at it as being way more ridiculous than The Dark Scientist, you might have more fun with it, because especially the ending starts getting wild. Wild as in psychotic break wild and going on, and we'll get there, but just prepare yourself and protect yourself. This is just a book discussion. It is not that serious, and I'm looking forward to reading The Dark Butler and what comes after that to discuss with you here. But This was just the experience that it was. Also, there is a character in this book named Lauren Chambers, which, if you're looking at the cover, that is also the pen name of the author. The author has a note in here that says Lauren Chambers is not a self-insert. I don't particularly know how Lauren Chambers, the pen name, came to be versus the character, but the author does say that they are not the same person, and Lauren Chambers does not play a important role in this story. The character is just sort of there. And that'll come into my criticism at some point too, because felt like a lot of fat on this book, and it's not even a long book. Anyway, a brief description of this book is it is about a young man named Gene. He is 17, 18 years old, getting into the next phase of his life. He is trying to outlive time because the concept of time freaks him out. After attempting to kill himself, he is taken to a therapist who offers him a wish to make whatever dreams come true he has. And one of his wishes is to outlive time or to outrun time. And he doesn't know if that dream was real or not. And this kind of starts him down the path of trying to create clones, of gene clones, and he's working on it with genes. And he's working on it with mice. What could possibly go wrong from there? Goes to university to study genetics and to continue with his experiments, and that's where I will leave the brief description there. The genre, I would say, is a psychological horror, closer to psychological horror, though it kind of gets into farce. I want to say farce as we get to the end. Now I'm going to read you a little bit more than the first page, because about the first page and a half is all one scene, and so I'm just gonna let that roll. Quote, despite his deepest wishes, time would not stop for Gene Morrow. He stood at the edge of the dock, feeling the storm brew. The wind whispered 4 words caught in his imagination, the one and only. It was a fond phrase that Gene had heard in his youth, perhaps a decade ago, in the echoing halls of the estate. Never one for television or the normalcy of current affairs, the little barbs of his circumstantial life would bring to him, the one and only. In his 16 years, he had received his first unfortunate ailment of plague of pneumonia that shifted his sleep cycle to the momentary lethargy and then nocturnal bouts of psychic energy. Once he had overcome it, he felt his brain wholly different. Clinicians told him it was teenage hormones. His father told him that it was normal and nothing to fight. Gene, however, worried that it was a permanent melting of his mind produced in the late hours of his illness when his comorbid fever reached 104. Since then, he'd ignored any passive appetite and afternoon activities with his peers during his months of boarding at school. When home for the summer or winter holidays, he'd walk a quarter-mile downhill from his estate. Every step would be another trudge back up the grassy incline to the main house, or along the lake to the perpetual empty servants' quarters. His godfather had told him, and upon their arrival so many years before, that the servants' quarters were haunted and never to enter, but that only gave Gene the idea to explore every corner and narrow passage. Hauntings felt like forgotten things, and Gene too felt, since his fever, there had been something exceedingly important for him to do. Only he had let it slip from his grasp like a chocolate wrapper onto the sidewalk somewhere out in the wide world. And so he had trekked down to the edge of the lake. He had sat upon the dock that once served a purpose, whether to fish or for families to take photographs as they leaped into the cool water. That, too, felt forgotten as the mists of mid-afternoon rolled in and spilled down over the mossy banks. The cold air cut through him, and as the breeze tousled his hair, he couldn't help but welcome the sensation, craving a touch that held some meaning. Soon, the dense air had masked the lake so thick that it would be mistaken for an ocean. Gene took off his sweater and tossed it in the water, letting it slowly wet and descend beneath the dark and glassy surface. Then his trousers and his sweetest watch, a gift from his godfather, worthless in the scope of the ache in his chest, plopped and dropped like a silver stone. The water would be above freezing, just enough to kill him if he let it, and so he looked back at his estate one more time, fleeting and yet calling him back. It had so much potential, but what would it do other than stand on a hill? Each season would pass. The sun would rise and set without its permission. Even his lake would freeze and thaw and refreeze with Gene underneath it, never to be found. Even with all his potential, this attempt would still be Gene's first great failure in his life, and so he fell forward into the water with a petty crash. Now, I felt like I needed to read this entire setup because this is the whole scene that kind of sets this character up, that starts with the vibe of the story, or what would give you an idea of the story, and also tells you partially, theoretically, what Gene cares about or what is going on in Gene's mind. And he's afraid of time moving on. He's afraid of failure. He's afraid of even like his massive mansion over there is useless to what it looks like. And he sounds very lonely. He sounds very isolated, alienated, that even what few people he has around him don't feel like they add a value to his life, and that he doesn't necessarily even feel important to them for that. Now, because we're getting this strong introduction already to who this character is, and it's going to switch very quickly, that is the reason why I felt the need to share this whole thing. Because in some cases, I felt like I was being gaslit as to who this character was, how old they were, what they were going through, because we're going to completely switch. And there was some level of this criticism as well for the scientist, where the opening part of the Dark Scientist, Catherine felt like a different person than she did like 2 or 3 chapters later, when she felt finally more established as like who she was and how she fit into the rest of the story. But this is so much worse, that it bounced back and forth on like what the character wanted and who they were and who and what Gene was pursuing. And for me, since I'm a character reader first, finding what drives the character and seeing them talk through themselves is the thing that matters the most to me. Because if you don't have motive, if you don't have personality, then for me, you don't really have a story, because the character is trying to pursue whatever is important to them. And if it changes constantly and it is their entire life thing, then you don't have a story. So with here, it seems that this was a suicide attempt of a 16-year-old Gene Morrow. When we pick up after this, he has been pulled out of school and is being watched over by his reluctant godfather, Jerome, who doesn't want anything to do with him, but has been put in this situation of guardianship since both of his parents are dead. They're all waiting for Gene to turn 18 when Jerome can go off and have nothing to do with Gene, and then Gene is like, I'll just kill myself once I'm 18 because nobody will be around anyway and nobody will stop me. Gene not only has a sweet tooth, but also seems to be checked out of human conversation. Nothing is doing better for him than when he took the plunge in the lake when he was 16, and he was hoping that he wouldn't be found. He is now on his way to a therapist, so apparently they took some time before, between the suicide attempt and the therapist, since he's now 17. When they get to the office, Jerome leaves him with the doctor, giving him a cold hug and saying, "Don't be a little monster, will you?" And so that also should say something about their relationship, about Jerome believing that Gene is some kind of monster, has been a misbehavior. Maybe he believes it was misbehavior and monstrous behavior to try to kill himself. You're going to get a lot of contention between the two of them, which is kind of unfortunate when it comes to the relationship between Gene and Jerome, because it kind of goes back and forth between Gene being very aggressive at Jerome and not caring and being completely uncommunicative like he is in the car here, versus him like begging Jerome to like pay attention to him because he cares about Jerome, and Jerome's one of the few constants he has in his life that he is afraid of losing as time passes. So it's this relationship with Jerome that actually makes the stakes kind of weird as the first hint of something not being right narratively. Now, his mentioning "don't become a monster, will you?" also is highlighted in the previous book, The Dark Scientist, where Robert said sometimes you have to become a monster in order to survive. And to use this specific terminology between these two books, it feels like it is something important thematically in these two. I can't remember, I don't think it's used the same kind of thing in The Dark Scientist, because I think I looked it up and I didn't see somebody say it in this way in the Dark Violinist, but I would have to double check again. Anyway, you would think that that would also come into this, and we would get an idea more of what Jerome believes that makes Gene a possible little monster. And we really don't. The therapist that he's seeing is named Dr. Lastra, who is significant because that is one of the names that was back in the boiler room listed in book 1, along with the 3 other men that made deals with the devil. The house rules are these, quote, "The townhouse that Dr. Lastra called home offered a bedroom, a small theater, kitchen, and multiple studies. The rules had been set down for this therapy clearly beforehand. Gene would write a letter a week, busy himself with the home, and have evening sessions with Dr. Dr. Lastra until they uncovered what ailed him. The general premise was surprisingly thorough for a fake science, Jean surmised, but then again, he figured that they got what they were paid for. An expensive vacation may just have been all he needed, just to keep him going a while longer. So obviously he's still thinking, I'm going to kill myself eventually when I'm just existing until I'm 18 and I can just kill myself again, which would have been more interesting. Oh my gosh, I'm starting to get flashbacks from all of the like red herrings and drop-offs we're about to get into here. The next morning, Dr. Lastra wakes Jean to get him on about the morning routine, just making coffee and asking friendly questions to get to know him. Quote, I'm curious if you have a competitive outlet. I'm competitive. Dr. Lastra eyed him and handed over the coffee. I run a 5-minute mile. Every morning I'm up at 6. I once built a laser when I was 10, strong enough that it burned down the old shed, and I read a book a day when I want. There's nothing I can't do. Jean stared him down, just to let him know how true it was. Is that a waste too? The fuel Jean felt tingling behind his eyes betrayed him. It was just a momentary flash of dopamine. Everything is, he said, his voice rasping in his throat. When he looked down, he saw a burning tear fall into the melting dinner. They ate in silence and neglected the coffee. Jean had finally relaxed when Lastra said, I won't challenge your convictions, Jean, but I will crack you open. Jean's chest caved in ever so slightly at those words. Dr. Lastra put down his coffee and stepped around to Jean's side, putting his hand unsettlingly warm on his silk back. Dr. Lastra looked deep into his eyes and asked, Will you let me do that, Jean? As Jean stared back at him, he could swear that he saw something behind Dr. Lastra's Latin eyes, a brief flicker of a reflection of an animal within. He felt how terribly close the man was to him, how his fingers raked along the base of his neck, and he nodded, not to give consent, but to see what would happen next. Dr. Lastra's lips parted, and he smiled. Thank you, Jean. Now you got me wondering here. We had Robert with his demon eyes. We had stuff going on with Sebastian in the violinist. It's been a while, so I'm sorry I can't be as specific with the violinist. I'd have to read it again. But obviously, animal creature inside of Dr. Lastra. Also, we know this because he was in the boiler room. But like, what sort of creature is it inside of Lastra? Because we know that it was the Wendigo in the other one. What powers was he granted that put him in this position that has that animal in his eyes? And we're not going to get the answer to that question. And I feel like I'm missing something in this book from the way that this story goes about. I feel like I'm missing some major things in this, actually. So even though I struggle with this book and I did not enjoy this book, possibly you all can help me see something that I may have missed via discussion, because there are things in this that it's past me, and it's partially because the characters just feel nonsensical to me. And again, maybe it's Anyway, also we get, quote, do you subscribe to any philosophies, Jean? No. Vacuous or dejected? Dr. Lastra asked as they arrived at a set of double doors beneath the banister on the main staircase. What do you mean? A man without a philosophy is either a sheep to any novel idea or beyond all crafted by others. Do you know why I like ice cream? Jean blinked. Because you're bizarre. Obviously, he kind of... Lastra obviously plays some verbal games and also just tries to throw people off, and I think it's to try to get surprises, like to try to surprise people by throwing questions like this. Quote, you know, Jean said, for a therapist, you really don't put me at ease. Dr. Lastra took hold of the double doors and opened them wide. A darkly furnished room opened before them with large windows muted blue and gray by the rain and sky. More bookshelves occupied the walls, along with several old artifacts. A bust of Alexander the Great in one corner, a large globe the size of a person in the other. A fireplace held the remains of burning embers from its last task, and dark leather couches encircled the center table, affixed with a myriad of cutters and lighters for the tobacco habit. It's not my job to put you at ease, Dr. Lastra continued. It's my job to remind you of your courage. You can do anything, right? Jean avoided his eyes, and so wandered the room as Dr. Lastra took a comfortable seat on his couch, reaching out to busy himself with his table. Going to the globe, Jean put a flat hand over the discolored crevice of Mariana's trench. You can't change some things. What thing? Dr. Lastra asked, taking up a thin cigar and cutting a wide V on its end. Things beyond man. Entropy, oblivion. They're horsemen. You separate yourself from those constructs, don't you? I hear it in your voice. So I'm sharing all of this because much like the dark scientist, this appears to be setting up the expectations of who Gene is, what he wants, what he's doing, and what we see in someone who is lost. He doesn't have anything or anyone, including his parents. He seems completely lost and also doesn't trust Jerome. Like, Jerome is just there because he's being paid to be there until he's 18, and Gene has counted on Jerome going away as soon as he is 18. So he's basically like, I'm not even going to participate with Jerome because I don't give a fuck, because Jerome's not going to stick around. Now, that then builds the expectation and the relationship that Gene and Jerome have had since Jerome has been the godfather, because it expresses that Jerome has never really been there for Gene. But so then why does Gene care even at all about Jerome? And it'll show later in the book that he does care about Jerome, and that Jerome theoretically cares about him, but we don't see anything in the way they interact or the way they talk about each other that might suggest what their relationship was when he was younger. And there is also the fact that Jerome was hired to watch over, to like basically be a handler for Gene, but then never really played a part. He was just like a guy that didn't have a house, that didn't have money, and apparently was not paid to actually act the part. He just kind of was a person that was there, which is kind of a weird control object to have in there with somebody that's just as controlling as the source of this experiment is. Jerome was a weird choice that I don't fully understand. We'll get there. We'll get there. I'm trying not to give you all the information. You're probably already forming ideas, but we'll get there. Further, Dr. Lastra says, what are dreams if not truth beyond our constraints? They're just dreams. No, they're nightmares too. Dr. Lastra, you're doing the annoying thing that therapists do sometimes. That doesn't mean anything. It's just trying to tell you you're wrong and catch you off guard so that they can then try to get you to say something else. That doesn't make any sense to me. It felt like that specific line felt, and a couple of times happens, where it's trying to say something profound, but it's not like grounded in anything. And I'm not entirely sure where the character is trying to come from. Now, all of this happens before the therapist, Dr. Lastra, gives Gene the run of the house, because he's not just like going to see the therapist once a week. He's going to be living in that house, kind of like a boarding house, visiting with the therapist multiple times a day. Now, I don't know what this setup actually is, where they freaking came upon Dr. Lastra, how they positioned this, because Dr. Lastra lives here with his boyfriend slash partner, how many rooms they usually have rented out for this. I'm not entirely sure how this was the one, other than it's obviously connected to whatever experiment Gene is involved in. At least that's my belief. Anyway, some of these house rules include they will have a 50-minute daily session. Minimally, it may go longer than that, but that will be how long they are seeing each other. What they are trying to accomplish in this, I am also not entirely sure, because there is this weird thing that feels like Dr. Lastra knows more than he is letting on, but is also lying, specifically not to Gene, but to the readers, to try to look like he is an innocent party when he's not an innocent party in this. After this setup, Dr. Lastra asks some questions that leads Gene's gooey center to come out. Quote, where do you find your intimacy? Gene thought of it. He didn't preoccupy himself to avoid such things, but they also seemed to be the worst kind of distractions, not that he found them of any better way. You don't gift a bull a china shop, Gene said. Why not? Gene glared at the bust, annoyed to spell it out. He said, how would intimacy solve this for me? I resent the idea. What part? The presumption that distracting myself with another person can solve the problem. Even if I spent my entire life doting on them and vice versa, she'd die and I'd die, and then it would all be more of a waste. So it's death? Dr. Lastra asked, not hiding a disappointment in his now bored voice. No, it's the engine of death, and I'm not with it. Maybe if I knew what to do in the face of it, but I don't, and I'm bored of hearing about potential, of all things that I can do. An old man dies and people say that he was this and that, but if a child dies, he could have been anything. So it's time that you hate. I'm indifferent to hate. When did you realize it was your adversary? Gene looks around the room a little while Dr. Lastra smokes. There's a bat pinned to a wall that he looks at and continues with the questioning. Quote, do you have much of a dream life, Gene? I don't remember them. You don't need to. I mean, it's all fantasy. Gene pulled his legs in, but didn't speak. Gene, I told you, I don't want distractions. The games with Dr. Lastra keep going as he finds where Gene's weak points are and winks at him, showing that he knows where they are at. Time is what sets Gene off. They pretty much nail that down. The mention of time, and he disappears into his head for a minute, but the kid doesn't relent when he gets pulled back by Dr. Lastra's pursue once he checks that Gene is okay. Quote, you want to kill time. Lastra said. There's certainly a new meaning to the phrase. Do you want to kill people? Don't be ridiculous, Jean Haggard out. It's not that ridiculous, and I'm only curious. I'm already dying, Lastra said, and then he whispered, moment by moment. The question is, what are you going to do about it? There's nothing anyone can do. You can't stop time. Would you destroy your body if it meant you could? Jean breathed deeply, but didn't rise from the spot against the table. His body? There was something so specific about that question. He knew Lastra was letting on to something. Would you turn your skin to the metal mercury in the pores? Would you be hated by God-fearing men? Jean asks how you can even turn yourself into mercury, and Dr. Lastra explains the only men to do what he is talking about were said to be alchemists, who had to give up their bodies in pursuit of their goals. As the session comes to an end, Dr. Lastra leads Jean upstairs to his room. Jean falls onto the bed, repeating the word alchemist over and over again as he feels like he has finally found his way forward. And this makes me believe that there is further information about the alchemist that is not put into this book that is what made this connection, because alchemy is not going to actually come into this story. He's going to get obsessed with reading for a little bit with alchemists, but where that comes as being the thing that would stop time or transform him into something is never truly described. And if it's similar to the previous book with the tree and the Wendigo information that was not explained, this might be another situation where the lore is not explained that makes the connection that then leaves the reader out. Later, Jean is walking around a park somewhere. It should be noted that this is set in New York, so there are lots of park places to just be walking around. And early to avoid running into people because he doesn't want to talk to people, he finds this one spot in the park with no graffiti or any signs of people. I bring this up because of the way the book has highlighted it. It was such a specific location that I don't know if it ever comes up again unless this is supposed to be a reference to the possible Grand Central Station underneath, which also is barely anything in the story. I wish that had been used more as well. Later at home, Dr. Lastra interrupts whatever Jean has been doing to tell him that it's almost time for their sessions and he needs to write a letter to his guardian. Jean doesn't want to do this. He knows that his guardian won't care. He could text him, but the letter is a requirement of his treatment. So he sits down, puts Jerome's name at the top of the letter, and writes his name at the bottom of the letter and just sends an empty letter. As Jean is working on this letter, he goes to the drawing room and leaves the door open because closing the door would have made him feel a bit claustrophobic. This other man comes in, one that he doesn't recognize, and the stranger starts talking to Jean. Jean learns that this man is from France, and he and his sister escaped their parents, and he chose to come to the United States chasing after a boy. And he says, stupid, yes, but the universe will work itself out, which then gives pause to Jean, who is thinking about the universe having patterns or a plan or something bigger in existence. He also learns that the man is writing a book about perception along with Dr. Lastra. This man's name is Dr. Chambers or Lauren Chambers. More back and forth with this guy, and he actually gives me more of an Alice in Wonderland feeling than somebody being hopeful with the way that he is like playing with Jean. Quote, "You're a doctor too? Dr. Chambers. You're French? Only when it matters. Why are you wet? Why are you dry?" From the way he introduces himself, I don't know if Jean should trust him, and I don't even know if we should trust him as a character, or if he's a figment of Jean's imagination. That could have been. He's not. He is involved with Dr. Lastra, but the way that this went, it could have been fake. There's something very uncomfortable about this man that's ticking off Jean's senses. Quote, "Why are you dry?" he asked, glancing over. The tilt of his head made Jean feel like a pest, so he turned back to his own letter. Staring at the gaping hole in the middle, he decided to not write anything at all. If he had nothing to say, why would he drone on? He turned the paper long and folded it into neat thirds to fit in the envelope. That proved easier said than done as he lined up the edges. As he slid it into its casing, a thought rolled from his mind off of his tongue. How do you change? He lost the incomplete thought in the end. Dr. Chambers was looking at him as if he had never looked away. Jean watched him back, but then he recoiled. He knew that it was a waste of an attempt asking for more illusions, a secret to change perception. Well, that's easy, Chambers said, burning. The doctor's eyes seemed so trained, turning on like a wind-up toy. But he sat so still that he could have been a wax figure. His eyes went dark, as if in heat for the idea itself. The disturbing quality stuck onto Jean's chest until he reminded himself to breathe. "What do you know about alchemy?" Alchemy. Only that it is wholly unnatural, like so many other enjoyable things, he said, taking his cigarette and ashing it straight on the table. He slacked his jaw in an odd way. Not quite a smile or even a grin, but it conveyed a joyous interest that Jean only wished that he could feel. I'd start with around chaos, Dr. Chambers said, and the Phoenix. Jean nodded and took his letter as he left the drawing room. Now, this scene with Chambers felt a little bit like leading Jean, like he went in there specifically to groom Jean in a specific direction, especially as Chambers works with Lastra, and Lastra is trying to get a specific response out of Jean. Now, grooming, I just mean like pushing him in a specific direction. Now, what that is at this moment, we don't know. Predators who see opportunities in other people, though, are fairly common in this series, and by predators, I mean Robert was a predator. The Dr. Was it Brownstone? The conductor Brownstone? Or Brown? It might have just been Brown. In Violinist, saw an opportunity in young Sebastian. It happens. Skip to Jean being in therapy with Dr. Lastra, and he asks about Jean's parents first. When asked, Jean says they died in a plane crash going somewhere, and the doctor's like, why weren't you with them? Jean is like, I don't know. And realizes or thinks about how Jerome never let him think about that subject specifically or sit on it very long to start asking questions about his parents. This then gets into asking questions about why he thinks Jerome won't let him think about that. Quote, my bias is in your favor, Jean, not the person who signs the checks, so I have to ask why. I don't know, Jean said. He never seemed to want to talk about it, and it's not useful anyway. Useful? Yes. What do you say useful? What do you mean? Are people of use? Would a family be of use? Jean leaned back, letting the sweet smoke of the cigar and the sunset rays battle in the air between them. He didn't know what Dr. Lastra was getting at, so he played the part of the patient watching the smoke dance in ribbons. I don't know. The difference between people and things, Jean? I still don't understand. That's fine, Lastra said in an earnest tone, a supportive one. What about people and animals? Is there a difference? A frontal lobe, Jean quipped. Dr. Lastra smiled. Do you think that there's an intangible essence? None that wouldn't be unique to every unique object. It's a difference of category. Are we getting into Aristotelian space? Have you ever had a pet? The line of questioning felt like a step-by-step battery. No, Jean said. And I take it, it's just you and your godfather. No siblings? No. Any close friends? Some schoolmates? Jean shrugged. Dr. Lastra digs on this a little further, and it seems like Jean can't think of anybody of importance in his life until he comes up with this girl named Maya, who he remembers from a summer that he went on a vacation with his family. And during that, they were at the beach, and he went out to the beach every single day to go and play with Maya until it was the final day. They had built this castle together, and he didn't want to leave when it was finally time to leave. So he ran away from home so he wouldn't have to leave with the parents and ended up at the place where he would normally meet Maya at the same normal time, but she wasn't there. He ends up throwing a fit, and Jean worries that Maya maybe have never actually been real, and he had spent the entire summer by himself. Quote, well, we know illusions are still real. Jean wanted to roll his eyes at Dr. Lastra's incessant wanting to prove his methods. Figures, I need stability, and I get sent to a dreamer. Dr. Lastra pursed his lips and said, could be worse. Yeah? You could have Dr. Chambers as your therapist. This is particularly interesting to me since the two doctors are writing a book together about perception, and we're still talking about perception, or so they say that they're writing a book together. And illusions are just a trick on perceptions. You believe things based on your perception to be true, even if it's not, which is still the truth to you because you don't know that it's not the truth. While Jean's complaining about Lastra being too much of a dreamer, he offers Lauren Chambers to be his doctor. Now that Chambers is brought up, Jean has the chance to ask about him. Again, this feels practiced, prepared. These two men are working in tandem to lead this kid to question things that they want, and we know Lastra set out to get stuff out of Jean in a very specific way. Quote, Lauren? Well, I'd say he had all of the time and the abilities anyone could have hoped for, but instead of fearing his finality, he purposefully embraces destruction, or novelty, or anything, really. I think he's been sitting in the bottom shelf of the fridge when he's bored. Still. You could learn something from him. How? Any way he likes. He's not a hard story to come across in your line of work. He was once a golden child for academia, and now he spends his time indulging old ideas and old vices. So I should learn to kill myself slower? You could learn to lean forward. Lastra said, and reached into the crook of his couch to produce a tablet. He unfolded the leather case and tapped away at it. I want to do a test. What kind of test? Nothing elaborate. Lastra turned the tablet around on his lap and showed a video, mostly white, and had a large triangle, a small triangle, and a small square, and two angled black lines in a crude shape and a doorway. In a crude shape of a doorway. The experiment is simply viewing this video and then having Gene tell him what he sees. When Gene describes what he saw, Dr. Lastra is like, "You're right, that is what's there," but then Gene thinks that he's lying and is like, what did you mean to show me on that screen? What was on that screen? And he believes that the doctor changed in how he is looking at Gene after answering the question. Quote, "Lastra's a thing too," Gene reflexively thought. "Everyone is. They all are. And any intangible essence was for people who want to lie about how relative the universe really is. Everyone's a cog, moving at the same pace through entropy, and Gene was the only one to see it. No false illusions of fiction called humanity would change it. But he couldn't tell Lastra that. No, he wouldn't listen. He'd just pick him apart. Lean forward, embrace it like billions of others on the ball of dirt." So after this, Gene leaves the room. To Jerome's side, because we're going to have a couple different areas where we bounce between multiple POVs, and that is one weakness that this book had over the other one, because the other book pretty much stuck to Catherine and Harry. This one, we're going to get Gene and Jerome and Maya and Victor and a random Dr. or Professor Oates and Dr. Lastra and just a bunch of perspectives that I think the story could have been stronger being told by a smaller scope. And the multiple perspectives just felt like they were there to tell the reader something specific. We'll get there. To the sides, now to Jerome. He's waking up in his home beside a hooker that he's been seeing long term, definitely a hooker. He actually seems very depressed. So the two of them get up and do morning things like making breakfast, and he hears that he didn't get laid last night, even though he paid the deluxe payment because he passed out. He was so drunk. He is being pretty mean about it. He is being pretty mean to this woman who just is trying to help him the entire time, and he thinks how Gene doesn't know things about him or the situation that the parents left him in, like why he was the one to be made the guardian, even though he obviously doesn't give a shit about Gene. Jerome might be bitter, and a part of that reads like he is missing Gene, even if he is always bitter when Gene is around. This is further proved when he receives a letter from Gene and sees that Gene pretty much wrote him nothing but a blank letter with names on it, and so then he snaps at the prostitute chick because he is angry. He is also so strung out that he really doesn't understand his own feelings. Going back over to Gene, he's setting up in his room, reading some of the alchemy books that were given to him by Dr. Chambers. Quote, "The nature was what Gene hated. The art, however, that was something he could understand. Art for artificial, that which man can make to imitate or even surpass. Nature wasn't always so nice. Time was fleeting. Winds could cut, water could quench, but flood the same. Art, though, that was dictated not by any divinity, but by the sanctity of one's own abilities. If only Gene could grasp how to create an art for himself, of himself, and live forever." Which is interesting change for him when this all started with him wanting to kill himself, and it sounded like he wanted to kill himself because he was alone, not because he feared time necessarily, or that he feared his own lack of accomplishments. But now he is like, I want to outrun time. And so the confliction between these two, I really don't understand. He openly has been saying how he is waiting until he is 18 to actually die. But now he's thinking about how he can live forever. What exactly is in this world that makes him want to live forever, that would actually inspire him to live? Now, if his entire thing is he is afraid of time passing and the things that he would lose with time passage, then it is not just him that he wants to live forever. It is the things around him, the people that are important to him or the things that are important to him, because he doesn't want those to decay either. He's talked about entropy, but like, where does that come into any of this? And how did that influence his trying to kill himself earlier? Now, it could have had him describe things that make it look like he is running away from time, but that's not actually what I took away from the opening scene. Let me know your thoughts. That's one of the reasons why I read the entire opening scene. Anyway, Dr. Lastra comes in saying that it's time for a session, but Gene would rather read the alchemy books, saying that it's more useful. Dr. Lastra obliges this. I don't know why, other than I guess, accommodating the experiment to see what happens, though he sits down and watches Jean read very intensely, which obviously starts a conversation. So that's why it's to manipulate Jean into a conversation if they're not going to have their meeting, their therapy session in the proper therapy room proper. Jean asks about the tests with the images and what that had actually meant because he knows there was something else behind it. Quote, "What am I to you?" Jean shouted, feeling the question should be for the whole world. That way it could reach the only other man who mattered to him at all. Lastra stared. "You're not a what, you're a person, and I am your doctor." Jean felt the reminder of his previous mistake now, returning unsolved, so ingrained into his way of thinking, his missing logic, hidden even from himself. "What was that test?" he demanded to know. He saw the same nothing on the doctor's eyes then that he saw now. The shapes and the lines. What does it mean? It's just a projection test. What was I meant to see? Dr. Lastra didn't answer at first. He put his hands into his pockets of his slacks and looked down at the floorboards. But most people view the large triangle and the small triangle as related, that the line isn't a barrier but a door to a house. The little triangle is playing with the little square outside until the parental triangle takes the little one in, leaving the square outside alone. Jean's anger subsided into a confused glare. "I thought it was interesting that you didn't project motives onto them. You didn't humanize them. They're shapes," Jean protested in only a whisper. "Yes. We're not all logical, Jean, but you are. Having what you have can be an addition, but it can also be a subtraction. I can tell. I won't turn this into another session, but if it's something new occupies your thoughts, will you let me know?" Here we get another glimpse into what Jean wants. So not only is he afraid of time, but he appears desperate to want some sort of family. But he is also so separated from everyone that he doesn't feel human, he doesn't see human, and he doesn't humanize others. Perhaps he fears time because it'll take away any family that he may have, be it Jerome or his parents who are gone. But then the question becomes, is he wanting to become immortal so that he can use that to make others immortal as well? There is also a further question in this, because I'm going to do a plot spoiler here right now so you can kind of see where I'm coming at with this and the way that I'm analyzing this now, in that Jean is a clone. He is a clone of somebody else. He just doesn't know that he is a clone. So as part of the way that he is analyzing this stuff, where other things do not have interior meaning, because he doesn't feel like he has meaning because of the way that he was created. He doesn't know that he is a clone. I'm saying, does his viewpoint of himself lack that intrinsic value of like a soul, the way that we think of it? Because he doesn't know how to feel it. And I don't really know a good way to describe this, so you're kind of just going to have to ethereally go with me. But if he doesn't believe that he feels, and if his brain works differently too, because he didn't gestate inside of a person that would give him a connection to another person in a way that you do when you're born, would that give him this separation from humanity and that he is feeling, and then the lack of belief, and then this belief, because he doesn't know that he is not a natural born human, does he believe that all humans experience things the way he does, which is why he doesn't believe that there is any value to his life or anybody's life, and there is no ethereal meaning, and they are all objects because he feels like an object, and that is from the way that he was born / created. Does that make any sense? Jean says that he's been reading this alchemy book that Dr. Chambers gave him, and it's not all stupid. He hates the spiritual stuff the most because it's like corny, but he said that it would be better than a therapy session and much more helpful. Clearly that's a lie because his reading of the alchemy stuff isn't even going that well. Alchemy is such a weird place for this magic too. If you are contemplating time and immortality, I'm sure that there is somewhere some subcategory of alchemy that might relate, but it's not brought into the story. Again, it feels like a reference to something bigger that is not actually brought into the story to inform the reader of why it is or what it is, its relation to the story is. I feel like Lastra or Chambers could have said something to introduce these ideas or sat down with Jean and talked about this in a little more in a way that would let the reader in on it. As we continue on, there are more cracks to appear in the motivations here, which makes the story feel like it started with one thing and then turned into something else at some point. Quote, "Jean, get out. You're a waste too." Dr. Lastra tilted his head, not in anger or even surprise. He still had his soft words ready. "You never consider giving things up?" Jean turned and ripped his eyes away. "I won't, and there is nothing that you can do about it. If nature would stand defiant, unreachable, so would he against it. Is it because you think that you can or you think that you must? Lastra asked, coming in closer. So it's confusing because he was giving up. The whole reason that he is here is because he attempted suicide, and he expressed his will to kill himself again, even if he survived. So this line of questioning where it goes, hey, are you planning on giving up? Why aren't you going to give up? Shouldn't you give up on this? Doesn't really make any sense to me. What exactly is he not giving up on? And when did his mindset shift from wanting to kill himself to now not wanting to kill himself and now wanting to outlive everything? Quote, Jean disregarded him, but thought about his answer. What's the difference? I can. I'm better. Lastra took a step closer, and Jean felt the man's eyes landing on every which way of his features, reading him like Jean read books. Then Dr. Lastra spoke his thoughts back at him. Do you think that you are better than others, Jean? Now, it's in him saying this that I think Jean's story is already less focused than The Dark Scientist, but it also has the same issue as The Dark Scientist, where the intro doesn't feel as though it captures what is really going on later in the story. And possibly that's because of the weekly installment way in which this was written for Kindle Vella, where maybe stuff was forgotten, or maybe there was no revising because it wasn't finished first. It was kind of going along every week to see what would happen next. And then moving from Kindle Vella to a novel, it didn't really change the opening to match the middle bits. As this scene plays out more, I feel like it proves kind of my theory a little bit. Quote, "You're a terrifying being to behold," Lastra said. But I bet you like that quality in yourself. Lastra was right, though it disappointed Jean to think that the doctor was immune to his anger. The alchemists wanted to change metal into gold, sure, but it had consequences. Their bodies turned gray, and their skin would rot should they not know what substances they dealt with. We're stuck with what we have, and we need to accept that in order to find what remedies our sufferings. I'll get another body. So I actually think what would have helped this more is if Jean was already doing some sort of experimentation in the beginning of the book somewhere that maybe almost killed him, and then he said that it was suicide to cover up what he was doing. If he didn't want Jerome to know, or if other people thought that he might be crazy. There are different ways that this could have been done, where he could have been kind of crazy in the beginning, but hiding that he was crazy, where he's like willing to destroy his body. And it could have been driven by the fact that he didn't have parents, or that his parents died. And even if his parents were a false memory placed in him, if he was still like, I am going to make this thing immortal, and then I am going to make it so nobody else around me dies, so that I am never without family, because obviously Jerome doesn't give a fuck about me. And so that all could have like gone into this, and I can do this because I am better, and once I do this, I am God. But like, and then that brings into the whole thing, because if he thinks himself better, if he has a God complex, then he is putting himself above the other creatures that don't have whatever he called an ethereal essence. But then what makes him believe that he is better than other creatures, which we don't get into that either. I think another direction that this could have gone was that he could have gotten in trouble in boarding school because he was manipulating other kids to do things for him. Something bad happened, like really bad, like somebody died. And this happened because he believed himself better than them and that he could use them, and even used teachers. And this caused an accident that became fatal, most likely. And he doesn't think that it is so much of a problem, and because he's better than those other people. And it could have come out at this point that that is exactly why it was. Or he has a mental break happen because of his parents dying, but if he wanted to keep the parents lost, or he had a mental break because of his parents dying, or you can combine both the ideas. Those are just two different directions that it could go, or things that could have been included to make this more work than the suicide of the self, where it's like, well, I want to die, I'm worthless. Okay, then how did we get to I am more important than time, and I am better than everybody else, and I will just create a new body? These are completely different mindsets. You see why I kind of went crazy with this? Dr. Lastra tries to convince Jean that it's relationships, not age or mortality or anything else, that makes life worth living. And Jean is like, I don't have any of those things, and no one knows this. Lastra insists that Jerome does care, but Jean doesn't see it, and he has the examples of it, okay? Why? Jerome doesn't even try to pretend to care. He is such a bad stand-in for a guardian. I don't know why you would hire this bloke. Then Jean starts having a breakdown and demands that he be told what to do because he doesn't know what to do. Time is running out, time is moving, and he can't stop anything. As he panics, Dr. Lastra tries to grapple at what exactly has gotten into Jean, while also basically headlocking him and holding him as tightly as he can to bring him back down from his panic. Quote, "There is a technique that I can show you. It is the closest thing to magic that you will find, but it has consequences. It will warp the earth and heavens and time to the machinations of your mind. But you must dream with me." Jean agrees to go with Dr. Lastra, and he is released, but he is offered Lastra's hand. He takes it, and they go. Dr. Lastra, still holding this kid's hand, leads him into New York. Again, this makes the kid feel younger than he actually is, and Jean constantly reads closer to like 12, 13, maybe 14, maybe even 10 at times than he does at 17. And holding your doctor's hand as you walk through New York is kind of weird. And it's not even hinted at that he would be the type of person to be like a daddy's boy or a mama's boy or just this little, because he has a superiority complex. He is very detached from other people. So we haven't really built what made it a believable action for him to take as a 17-year-old boy. Now, Dr. Lastra, well, as he is leading Jean, takes him into the subway, and then they go into the Grand Central Station underneath the main subway, and I think that's what it's called, the old train station that is underneath in the sewers of New York. And he says that he is going to be taking him to the chapel in this place. Lastra says that they will have to move the heavens and the earth with his will if they are going to do what Jean wants to accomplish, and Jean is just going with it, which, considering how much Jean has been like, religion is stupid, the religious is stupid, all of this is stupid, he just kind of goes with it. And if he was at least slightly more open-minded with just believing anything or willing to try anything as opposed to the actual aggression that he had earlier, okay, but he held aggression specifically towards the religious parts earlier mentioned, and so then I don't know what has changed between this and him judging the spiritual stuff in the alchemy books. Even without question, quote, "Jean was never one for religions or superstitions, but the way Dr. Lastra looked at him from the other side of the basin in the glow of the colors of the moonlight and the glow of the colors of the candlelight and glass, it seemed he wasn't one for such playthings either. That only meant that he was dead serious, and Jean was dead certain that either whatever this was would work or he'd be dead the moment he had a chance. Okay, let's do it." Dr. Lastra's mouth twitched. "I have to tell you, this may seem either silly or extreme, but I've seen it do the impossible, create the impossible." So Jean obviously is like, well, it's going to do something or I'm going to die. So whatever, it's whatever. But even him being like, okay, so what exactly are we doing here? Him even asking questions, not even like being against Dr. Lastra doing this, but just asking Dr. Lastra questions like, what are we doing here? What do you mean by moving the heavens and the earth? Where did you learn this? Like anything that would also not only inform Jean, but it would also inform the reader of like where this is coming from. For all of the back and forth is in his office, he has nothing to say here about relying on religion or the movement of God or the devil, which also could have been a reference here with some eyes going on, because we know that Dr. Lastra got something going on with his creepy eyes. And we also know that happens because the eyes are the windows to the soul, and they got the devil in their soul. They did that a while ago. I think that Jean would have pushed something, at least, to ask some questions before this goes in, or maybe even just insult him on his religiosity of like, oh, you're one of those. Chambers, I guess, is better grounded than you. Something like that. But, or Jean commenting on how stupid it is, and then Dr. Lastra being like, fine, then I can't help you. And Jean being like, wait, I take it back. Okay, I'm willing to try. Like, just to let it be. But again, this goes to the same issue that I mentioned in The Dark Scientist, where it didn't really seem to let minor conflicts happen where they would, to just let characters disagree and then to move from there. Now in the chapel with everything set up, Dr. Lastra asks Jean what his wishes are, and Jean says that he wants to see Maya again. He wants that missing piece of himself that he couldn't see the shapes of that family, and he wants to stop time around him. Now where that missing piece that he can't see inside of him, the essence, I'm assuming that is the soul essence. I don't know if we ever actually get that in his wish fulfillment here that we're about to get into, because he is always short. He is always short. Lastra warns him about his wishes, but Jean insists this is what he wants. Lastra carries out the ritual. At this point already, the alchemy seems to be a mismatch to this story, unless there is some other part that I'm missing as to how the alchemy comes into the story. Alchemy is not going to come up ever again, by the way. It is not an interest of Jean's and is not part of his laboratory tests that are going to come up in creating clones. So I don't really know what the choice of alchemy was. Jean has a dream then where he's struggling to stand up. He's older and he sees himself in the mirror with hollowed cheeks and he holds on to the sink. He wakes up again on a couch. Frankenstein is playing on the television and Dr. Chambers is watching over him as Dr. Lastra is taking a break and they're shift changing with each other. Dr. Chambers tells Jean that Lastra stated Jean was out partying when Dr. Lastra found him. Chambers knows that that's a lie, but he's just watching over him without asking further questions. Oddly, the movie never seems to finish no matter how long it goes on, and Jean wakes up again with a bolt. The projector is showing no input, and everything that he had just experienced was just a dream, even his talking with Dr. Chambers just now. He runs out into the hall where Lastra and Chambers are in another room together drinking coffee, and Jean declares, "I have it." Switch to Jerome. Quote, Jerome sat at the edge of the dock, his bare feet wading in the cold water. He thought to throw Jean's latest letter in the lake, to let it soak and drown the way that he had. The numbness of the written words had long since faded, and his panic arose in Jerome's stomach. Pangs like Maury bells seeped through the tired souls with each beat of the heart. He felt that he had failed Jean yet again. He looked down for the 100th time at the sparse letters. His godchild was coming home, but definitely different now from after whatever Dr. Lastra had done. Now, I don't know how far the time skip is in this. It doesn't really imply how long that he has been with Dr. Lastra. He is still like 17, maybe closer to 18, as he's going to be going to something to try to get into a university very soon. How he did that without continuing his classes, even in homeschool, I'm not entirely sure because it never mentions anything with him doing studies. And Jerome is at the dock when Oscar, another employee, comes up with the phone. We don't know who is on that phone, just that they ask, "Is it dead?" Jerome answers, "It's alive. It worked." The voice says, "Good," and hangs up. So I guess that was some sort of cloning event that just happened, possibly, because Jean possibly could have died. I'm not entirely sure, actually. Like, I don't feel like we ever get full closure on this. You'll have to let me know what you think. If you read the book or if you pick up other things throughout the rest of this review, let me know. This is one of the reasons I like to share stuff, is to get others' opinions on directions that I will obviously miss because I am a single brain cell of a being. I don't even want to say person. Quote, "It would be over soon," he told himself, but all he wanted now was a little more time. Returning to Jean, he's eating ice cream with Lastra and Chambers, and they're all in a very chipper mood, like exceedingly so. Quote, Jean painted lines into his food. On the crescent of the untouched half of raspberry, he made the shape of a man, then beneath he crafted another, young, and beside that, a female. Then one as a control at the bottom. One to study. The little head, the little body, he narrowed his eyes at it. Strangely, though, it became his favorite. Just the idea of making a man like Frankenstein had exhilarated him. He felt his chest open at the thought, pumping warm blood through, sweet like raspberries. It was such a perfect idea. He could spend his entire life perfecting such an endeavor, and when he was gone, he wouldn't be. But, as he imagined, one element stood in his way, the only piece of his puzzle left unsolved. Either Lastra's magic had set his world, his mind right, or it was a curious coincidence to fall the same night that Jean was to find his way. Time hadn't stopped, nor did he want it to now. So he hoped one fleeting and, with luck, inconsequential hope that the ritual game wasn't real. He felt a lingering fear about it, beneath his newfound calmness, like a bloodhound on a trail. But none of that could be real, he told himself. Is this why? Nah, I'm still confused. I was like, is this why? Nah, this feels like his attempt to do the finding the missing piece, and so immediately like, oh, here he is seeing a thing as a person that he couldn't see before, but it doesn't really make any sense, and it doesn't show up anywhere else. He ends this chapter with, quote, "Coconut," whispered Lauren abruptly, sensually, and Dr. Lastra dropped his spoon into his bowl with an exasperated clank. Like every time Chambers is in the same room with Lastra, it is just so they can like flirt, or in another scene Lauren gives Lastra head, and I'm like, this didn't add anything to the story for me. Like any of the scenes, especially that are just the two of them before like the phone call with Jean, it doesn't make a difference, and it just feels like Lauren is there to be Lastra's partner, but not like it is anything in the story, and it just comes misleading because you get like this super focus on Coconut. Little Tatum. Sorry, did I disrupt you? I love you. So 9 months later, Gene is sitting in his school waiting to see the dean for an interview for university, it seems. He finds one of his mice named Nero in his shirt/jacket. He knows that he can't take it in there with the meeting because it will, not look good. He sees another kid in the waiting queue with a beanie. He eyes the beanie to hide the rat in, and the kid just cowers at Gene's approach. Are we dealing with 17/18-year-old New Yorkers or children here? Not only that, the kid doesn't put up any sort of fight. He doesn't yell. He doesn't punch the kid. He doesn't do anything. And how are we supposed to assume that Gene is some imposing character yet? We haven't gotten any idea as to how physically imposing or threatening or scary or his reputation is. And that actually would have made sense if he had actually hurt somebody on campus before previously, and there were rumors about what he did, and nobody wanted to be in the sights of that freak who turned some other kid into Frankenstein. Like something like that. I don't really know why this happened, but he takes the kid's hat and puts the rat in and then puts it like back on the kid's head. Also, I think a better choice here to show just how brutal Gene is, because we're going to have a situation later where he is told to, be nice to the rats. So if you want to dehumanize the rats, and you would think because this rat has a name, Nero, that it's going to be important, it's not. That's a mislead. Again, that doesn't turn into anything. But if you wanted Gene to look really brutal and dehumanized like he was before, you have him find the rat on him being like, oh, this wasn't supposed to be on me. This was supposed to be at home. Crack its neck and then drop it on the ground. Like that shows just how little he values these creatures. And it'll give a good comparison for later when he's talking to Maya and when he is in the lab of Theo and Victor, and he is being seen as the rats that he also mistreated when he was the scientist, the creator of the rats. Switching to a perspective of the school staff, which also makes no sense. He's now in Oates' perspective, or we're in Oates' perspective, and it's literally just to tell the readers how other people view him in this scene, when we could have gotten that by how they respond to him, and it would have been more effective and uncanny, I think. Anyway, when he goes into this meeting, he's asked about his grades, his accomplishments, why he should be praised for his grades that are subpar, and Gene says, well, he might be unable to do the work, but he puts his efforts into his passions, which are what matter, which is the genealogy, and he is going to surpass everybody else in the field in which he is interested in being in. Quote, Oates smirked to himself. Not a poor student, this kid knew exactly what cards he had been dealt. While his hair was left uncombed, his suit jacket was designer, his leather case formal, yet he had a special something intrinsically his own, the luxury of needing no other luxuries to stand out. His unblemished skin, too porcelain for a boy his age, screamed a quiet money. Where the many other boys and girls at the many other private schools they visited that week kept an aloof sensuality, a don't touch me with your dirty hands mentality, this boy had no sense of superiority for his lucky birth. His superiority to command the room came from within, and yet Oates still saw nothing but coldness behind his eerily icy blue eyes. This threw me off because we're contradicting before. Now I get it. He's gone through a mystical transformation, and he could actually be manipulative now, though he wasn't before. He was a little brat before. But it's a third person that is telling us this. It makes me not know who we're supposed to be trusting, and not giving us a solid ground on what is reality and who is not speaking reality. Gene states that his goal is also genetic research, which with a name like Gene. They also ask why, and he explains, quote, we're poorly made. Time and entropy rip us apart, and maybe I don't think that's fair. The ability is to sequence a genome, to grow that code again, it speaks to a new form of creation, beyond the animal ways. The people here aren't liking just how he's talking about animal testing, or the pride that is now coming out. Quote, 6 months. Oates said. You know nothing of what you do. Brilliant, sure. Wise, not a chance. No one will argue that what you've done is prolific if true. But you need temperance. Temperance? Gene smiled with depraved bewilderment at Oates's reason. What's wrong with your leg? He asked, and Oates reflexively gripped his cane, but also shot up a finger to tell the boy to watch it. It isn't a hip. You're too young. It can't be diabetic neuropathy. You're too fit. So it's not your foot, it's your leg. My work would fix your leg. Chop it off. Grow another. Going back to what would have been the inciting incident, this following quote from the interviewer, Oates, I feel like, bolsters the idea of where this could have come from. Quote, Oates sat back and threw up his arms, but the other deans cowardly remained silent. So Oates took up the folder in front of him and showed Jean his own picture in front of a mouse utopia. I don't see a researcher. I don't see a wise scientist. I see a boy trying to play God, straighten what he hath made crooked. That is, if I go back to this idea that he might have killed somebody in a previous, in his boarding school, and there are rumors about it, then you would have, and then you have this. It could be that guilt of having killed somebody with his actions, even if he doesn't recognize it as that, mixed with this need for control. That, too, doesn't necessarily work with how he has begged on his knees for Lastra to do something. I mean, that could have been out of desperation, of wanting something and everything to stop, for time to stop, out of fear of losing control, and I think that's a very powerful story. But I think the inciting incident for this book was kind of off in setting it up for who he actually is being shown to be and his ambitions. Things in the interview get a little bit out of hand. Quote, "We have an excellent scientists," Oates went on, "scientists who understand the origins to study his creations to better know him. You tamper with Mother Nature at your peril." Well, since we're quoting dead men, I think it was Galen who said, "I not only think that we will tamper with Mother Nature, I think Mother wants us to. Go to hell. Not before my art is done." Jean is sent out of the office, while the other adults start lecturing Oates for telling the student to go to hell. They're like, this is going to cause a scene, this is going to be spread around, there are going to be rumors about this, and you can't finesse yourself out of this because you've already sent him out of the room. So now what are we going to do? As they are arguing with one another, we then switch back to Jean, and it's the fact that we're going back to him immediately after the scene ends that, again, the perspective was switched just for the narrative to tell us how to interpret things instead of letting it just live with Jean being our guide. He collects his rat from the one kid he left it with when the dean comes out and welcomes Jean to the campus next year, because this is how he is apologizing for the scene that just happened in that room to hopefully keep the rumors low. If you think that this is going to come up later, it's not. This is kind of just the solve to get Jean to the school when his grades are meh, and that just happened. Jean returns outside where Jerome is waiting for him with the car. They bicker, where Jerome is incredibly irritable. Once they get into the car, Jean puts his rat in the glove compartment. Jerome reminds him how much he hates that thing, and when Jean says, well, I can just throw it out, Jerome is like, no, you don't need to kill that thing like that. The difference here and how disposable the rat is compared to inside feels very weird to me, when he could have just killed the rat earlier, and then Jerome could have been like, didn't you come here with a rat? Or, obviously didn't, because he found the rat when they were inside, but whatever. They're driving off to have lunch when an alarm in the science building goes off, and Jean says, wasn't that where you had discarded your cigarette? And Jerome is like, it can't be. And they drive off. So this is one of those moments where it now feels like it's kind of being a comedy, because that also translates into nothing. I don't know why that scene ends there like that. At the restaurant, Jean is demanding chocolate milk, which they don't have at this fancy place, so Jerome demands that they go out and get it to appease Jean. Why? Again, I'm not really sure why they're jumping through these hoops when it doesn't seem Jerome really cares about Jean, but now he is like getting lushly drunk and making sure that all of Jean's needs are taken care of, maybe because it's coming to an end, maybe because that phone call that he had back at the house affected him. I am not entirely sure, but Jerome is being very demanding of these workers at this restaurant to go to the corner store to get chocolate milk just to make Jean happy, and also bring that bottle of wine. I want all of the wine. Really leaves you a lot of questions as to why Jean's parents left this man to be the guy in charge, and even if we pretend, okay, the parents are probably fake because this kid is a clone, why was this the guy that was put in charge of Jean as the controlled parent to see how this kid turns out? It's a very weird thing to give him like all of the money and all of the things to be successful, but then also give him just this lush, bad influence guardian. I'm not entirely sure what the controlled situation was supposed to be for this guy. We get more feelings of Jean toward Jerome. Quote, when Jerome tried to speak, only a pathetically unposh slurp of air sounded out, and he shut his mouth, never taking his eyes off of his glass. Jean watched in a sick fascination as the man who grounded him, scolded him, insulted him, and did everything for him always collapsed like a cheap gingerbread house. The gumdrops at the toothpick gate date, dropping before going stale, forever stuck to the icing snow ground. Jean had made one when he was 10, not understanding the joy on the children's faces on the packaging wasn't from the house or the gummy bear inhabitants, but from each other, and he didn't realize why his other construction alone in the kitchen was so solemn from the reason. But here in the restaurant, trying to tell the only important person in his life that he loved him, he felt a solemn frustration again. He thought to reach out and take Jerome's hand, rub his thumb knuckles the way that Lastra had done to Chambers when he had thought that they were alone, but he couldn't bring himself to reach out. He was too afraid that he'd somehow do it wrong and make it worse. It was the first time that he had ever worried that he would break something that couldn't be replaced, and that something was within a person, a bizarre, invisible thing to break. Jerome randomly says, "Please don't be like him," in between chugging down a bottle of wine. Jean is thinking of trying the wine for the first time. He has been told never that he's not allowed to drink at all by Jerome, but Jerome is like, you could try it this time. However, by the time Jean is actually ready to try the wine, Jerome has drank all of it down, and there is nothing to it. Because Jerome has been so freaking rude, before they can even order any food, the restaurant is like, "Get out." Because Jerome is wasted, Jean is the one driving back, even though he doesn't even have a permit. He whips around and Jerome is getting sick and demands that they pull over so Jerome can vomit. For a second, Jean thinks about hurting Jerome in some way, but ultimately pulls over, hurting him because he is freaking annoying. And we never see this kind of aggression anywhere else. And it's literally right after he's like, "I would like to touch him, but I don't want to mess things up and break things in ways that can't be fixed." But he's already just cold. Like, what is going on with this kid? As Jerome vomits, Jean is thinking about how he just thought of Jerome similarly to the sickly rats in his utopia, how he tortures them and hurts them on purpose, sometimes before they die. This is such a whiplash considering the sentiment from the restaurant. Jean gets out of the car and goes over to Jerome, but trips and lands on him. Jerome whips around going, "You're not the first." Jean interrupts this with, quote, "He wasn't the first to be denied what he wanted from Jerome. And no matter how hard he would try, Jean knew that he wouldn't get it." "Kill me if you want," Jerome hollered into the air, "but don't just let me die. Don't make me wait for it. I'm done waiting." Jean sighed, feeling the sun go down and the air go cold. A howl sounded in the distance, not a dog, but some animal made of wind. "You're a drama queen," he told his godfather, and got back into the car. They're now both throwing tantrums all of the time, I swear. Dude is obviously talking to Theo, God of the experiments, possibly just Lastra. We don't know. I don't really know who is the God King in charge of everything. I think it's Lastra. But if true, Lastra lied to me as the audience, so I don't know. Now it's time to skip, and he's on a train to going to college campus. A boy comes in briefly asking if he can sit next to Jean, and Jean is like, no, go the frick away. Jean is keeping up connections with Dr. Lastra, writing letters regularly, and writing down different questions that he would like to ask him, like, quote, "Where was I during the plane accident? Who is Maya? Why did Jerome have his list? How did he know he'd have to raise me? Was he lying now? Why do I have a missing piece? Will time stop for me?" So we're still like, the missing piece is still being thought about. So then what was those weirdnesses in the previous scenes? Obviously, nobody is noticing his change in behavior, so I don't even know if that's canonically true. He writes a letter to Jerome, as always, leaving it blank, and at the bottom, instead of saying, like, "yours truly" or whatever, he says, "not the first." He gets to school and looks around at the lab mostly, and then he gets to his dorm room where he meets his dorm mate, which is the guy from the train, whose name is actually Augustus. Now, if you think that this guy is going to be important, he's not. I don't know why we got the weird introduction on the train, and then why we have this where he gets a name, and then why Jean is going to go to parties with this guy. But this guy has literally zero importance to the story and is not going to mean anything. So after they check into the room, or after Jean checks into the room, then the guy is like, "Hey, why don't we go to some frat parties? I'm part of frats. I'm a jock. You can come with me." So they're hanging out, and they're people watching while they both drink and just hang out. And Augustus is saying how he misses his girlfriend. He could call her right now if he wanted to talk to her, because she would answer. But he says that he's pretending to be away for the weekend, so he really can't call her. And then he just randomly blurts out that "I'm not gay." Jean says he's not either. Augustus says, "Sorry about your autism," while also he's confused, and then Augustus runs away. The whole scene is bizarre. I don't understand. It should be noted that Nero also made it out of the rat utopia because before Gene came to the university, he just wiped out the entire rat utopia at his house. But Nero got into his clothing, into his luggage, and is now there with them. If you think that this is going to mean anything, you're wrong. Nero, I think this is the last time Nero is mentioned. Now, time skipping, he's doing an experiment, hating school. It's almost his birthday, and he's looking forward to seeing Jerome for his 18th birthday, though why he thinks he's going to see Jerome for his 18th birthday when they've discussed how Jerome is just going to piece the frick out when he's of age, I don't know. He hasn't even been trying. So he's like looking forward to seeing Jerome all the time while also writing him blank letters and not really trying to connect with Jerome, which again sends mixed signals of him saying, I super value you, but also I'm not going to put any effort into these letters and I don't understand what I'm missing. In class, they're also talking about morals and capability and physical capability. Quote, Oates angles his cane as a crutch. So a man who can should, and vice versa. Gene stared as he chewed on the inside of his cheek, and Oates twisted and inferred his yet unshared words. He knew that he shouldn't engage. That would imply an expectation for future lessons. And then something tugged at him, and he said, If you can, you can. It's that simple. If you can't, then you're not part of the equation. You can talk morality and fairness as much as you want, but when teeth come out and blood runs, morality becomes moot. Oates didn't offer a response at first. Rather, he looked around to see if anyone would offer a counter-argument, but the room was silent. Anyone? I'm being mauled here, so you can't live up to your potential without being immortal. Gene went on. Morality is for those who can't do better. He gets a call while he's arguing with some girl who is upset that he implied disabled people were weaker, eventually seeing himself out of the class so that he can take the phone call because it's Jerome on the phone. Jerome says, It's over, I'm gone, we're not seeing each other ever again, goodbye. And also, don't wash your coat. In his room, Gene is looking through his coat and he finds a miniature USB. He plugs it into his phone and the program installs and it says that it needs a password. He can't get in. He switches over to Lastra's POV as he stands over a sink, bloodied and bruised on his face. He did something that to Chambers that intones it was something worse than how he looks right now. Again, keeping a distance and secrets from the reader that shouldn't be there because it's just there to keep the tension of a mystery when it would be more tense to know what is going on and what Lastra's connection is to this. And is Chambers also a clone? Not, of him, but like of maybe somebody that Lastra was into. He says that he must prepare for another session soon. I think that this chapter was just another argument for me as to why this book should have stayed in Gene's perspective, because it would switch perspectives just to throw like random small things at you that are maybe supposed to be intriguing, but for me they were just distracting, if not just downright, I don't like it because you're hiding things from me and not telling me things. Then we are sitting with Gene in the courtyard, mourning, depressed at the loss of Jerome because he's just gone. He's paid someone else to do his homework while he's just hanging out. Not sure what he wants to do because going home to an empty house isn't really of interest to him. Then he sees this girl that he is absolutely sure is Maya just before the dean comes over to sit down with him. He recognizes that Gene is not doing his own homework and is probing him to open up about what is actually going on in his life. While talking to this guy and pushing for understanding, Gene comes up with a 4-letter passcode that might be the one for the USB stick. He agrees to meet with the dean or with Dr. Oates, Mr. Oates, whatever, on Sundays, but runs off to go and test the code that he had just thought of. So he's already tried 2 times to open this USB with incorrect codes, and he only has 3 before everything on the USB will be deleted. Since he is not sure if the code might be Maya, he's not going to try it until he is absolutely certain. Instead, he calls Dr. Lastra to talk about everything that he found. Dr. Lastra says that he'll see what he can do to find out information from the Godfather and what the Godfather Jerome meant to do with that USB and what the USB means. Now, does Lastra know what the USB is? Does Lastra know what Jerome is involved in? That's the question over here. And why would Lastra help? I mean, Lastra obviously knows he's involved, but like, how is he involved? At what exactly is going on here? Because Lastra shows up every so often throughout this book just to kind of be the hand that leads the characters. It kind of reminded me of Grady Hendrix. I was like, oh no. Oh no. He also says that he'll have to keep his snooping away from Chambers, which tells us that Chambers isn't dead, even if we had just seen Dr. Lastra all beaten and bruised. So there is that. Jean briefly talks to the girl Maya at the chapel, and it is so awkward and there is no chemistry whatsoever. She doesn't really want to talk to him at all, but she has to peel herself away. Then he talks to Dean Oates about his missing school work and agrees to work on something himself. Jean asks about the florist, if there is a good florist, because he wants to impress Maya and he needs to get there. He also doesn't have a car, so he asks Oates to take him, and Oates is like, it's going to be really awkward because he has a motorcycle, though he doesn't say that yet. And Oates is like, well, considering that I think you're a right-wing, self-centered naturalist, this is a great step forward. I don't even know where that comment came from, because he's just asking about getting flowers. Oates is a weirdo. Definitely a weird one, as the first thing that he said in this section was thinking about how he wanted to date a barely legal girl. I don't know. Oates is bizarre. I don't understand his character. Oates agrees to take Jean to the flower shop, and then they talk about his future, and Oates tries to get to the bottom of what's going on in Jean's life. Jean reveals that he tried to kill himself a year ago. Quote, why? I couldn't stand how time marched. I needed a shield or a meaning to stand in spite of it. Do you have that now? Yes, I found it in alchemy, in magic, in my art. But the mice, they're just mice. How do you intend to finish what you started? What's the end goal? You never said before. I don't think I should say. But you know? Yes. Oates turned to face him as he forced the words out next. You're not going to clone a person, are you? An eerie beat passed, and Jean turned his head just slightly to Oates, his eyes still masked, and he said, of course not. It dropped a wet chill down Oates's back. Of course not. You seem scared, Jean said. I don't think that I'd be cruel to my creations as God is to you. I hope not. But you may be. Why? Because you can. I can? Jean said, and took a deep breath. Oates hoped that he was pondering the moment, but his voice carried far away, and he changed the subject entirely. I don't think Jerome could leave me so easily. I think that he was made to. Your godfather? By whom? I don't know. I used to think that my life was filled with coincidences, but now, a deep frown cut the face. It's contrivance. Are you telling me now that you believe in God? No, only in me. So some things with Jerome here is I think that he should have been set up to be like at least pretending to be a better guardian so that we could believe it, even if he was just this hooker drug doing person when Jean wasn't around. We needed to see something here that would make Jean believe that Jerome actually cared about him and that he wouldn't leave when he turned 18. Because even in chapter 1, Jerome was like, as soon as you turn 18, I am peace the freaking out. So what would make Jean suddenly believe that Jerome cared about him and wouldn't leave on his own? Because we have no evidence of the contrary in how any of them interact, how they talk, and in previous chapters. Jean receives a letter from Dr. Lastra and hides it to go and open it in the privacy of his lab. He's thinking even more about Maya and talking to her, how she's different from other people, and how there's this look in her eye. At some point, he's wondering if she would have looked or been just like him if she had been born a male, because there's something very familiar about her. She appears in his lab, and the way that she chides him for giving her too many flowers, because he gave her like hundreds of flowers. He bought like so many flowers. Of course, remember, this kid has money. But the way that she chides him, he says, makes him feel like a little boy, and he likes it. He keeps thinking how similar she is to him, challenging him, disapproving of how he's been doing things. She's not an innocent girl of his memories or his dreams. She says that she would rather be friends with him than anything more intimate than that, and so she hopes that he's okay with that. He needs friends, and she says that she doesn't want to be alone. And one other thing is that she keeps telling him that she wants him to change one of his rat clones. Quote, but you want to be friends. I don't want to be alone, and I know that you don't want to be either. How would you know that? No one does. But I want you to fix your mice. Why? Because, Jean grinned. Because what? Because they shouldn't all be the same. What should they be? She seemed lost for words and then turned to go. Maybe I was wrong, she said, but Jean stopped her and took her arm. Wait! She pulled from his grip and he felt something slipping. So he said, the only thing that he could think of at the time, I can make them glow. She asks what color and he asks what her favorite color is or what colors she would want. She says she is happy with anything but blue. She also says that she used to believe in some things, learned some other things, and now she doesn't really believe in anything. She felt like a defining beat for what will come next. And there is also, I think it's trying really hard to make the parallel of like treating the clones as individuals on their own instead of like as all just being a derivative copy that has no intrinsic value, because I think that comes later with the way that Jean's existence is talked about. But I don't really understand the way that it comes at this. And it instead feels more like it's trying hard to reach the theme, but the character interactions don't really make sense. Jean is now in the quad doing homework with Maya, and she's already done with her essay. And he is saying, quote, he never really tried. He liked the idea of her too much, the idea of someone to wake up to and to see the mornings for coffee. It's really weird when this is like a female clone of you, a female version of you, and you're both clones. Basically your sister. Now, I'm not sure what to draw from this other than a mirror of himself, but they didn't even have any sort of chemistry in the last chapter. I can understand him being desperate for attention and companionship because it's always something that he has wanted, at least in various parts of this book, but he hasn't had any reason to be drawn to her so hard specifically. As she does her art, she uses his face for oil on the canvas, like touching and then so she can have oil on her page. He asks her what her paper is about and, quote, that anyone can defy their fate, biological, circumstantial, within reason, mostly place of birth, though intention, mostly place of birth through intention. If there's the opportunity to be contrary, there's a chance to be free. Free, why? That's where the individual lies. Again, with wanting everyone and everything to be a special, unique thing, Jean thought. He looked out at all of the students, like little ants walking across the quad, and descended the stairs beside them. Sure, they all looked different, but none of them really were. Not like him, not like Maya. He knew that. His mice were special because each looked the same, because he made them that way, until the new generation would glow and glow. It was a promise that he did not intend to break. It feels, again, more like it's forcing the theme of nature versus nurture, biological determinism in a way, but we're not seeing it in the story. It's just happening in the conversations around the story. And then Jean's obsession with everybody except me is stuck on this track, and he's looking at other people, and that's probably also part of it, where he thinks that he is actually free to make his own decisions and he is better than other people when he is actually a clone. And he's looking at his clones being like, well, they're in a controlled environment because I am the controller, without realizing that he is also in those things while judging other people as being lesser than him. As this conversation goes on, Maya pretty much starts acting like Lastra and challenging Jean, quote, I want you to test me. Sometimes I don't know if I believe what I say. You're too dumb to question if you're ever wrong. Jean smiled again, knowing that she wasn't being serious, just teasing him, of course. He was never wrong. But he found it cute that she would say that he was dumb. Dumb the way that boys were when it came to girls. Augustus acted like that during his many dorm parties. He acted like he was a robot leaning cool against the wall. You're right, Jean said. But I think that you're good at art, even though I don't see any use for it in life. Life is art. What you choose to do is art. I once called my work art. Just not in that way. Go on, Maya said. Argue. The idea of being a contrarian depends on disposition. People are born with them. To be lazy, to be industrious, there's a 50-50 temperament to the enigmatic experience equation that's been replicated hundreds of times in the social sciences. While that whole field is mostly useless, the closer you get to sociology, the personality psychologists up until 200 years ago seemed to be decent enough before the politically correct answers seeped in. Still, anything with a correlation of R.5 and up is a miracle and should be taken seriously. You're wrong. What? You're wrong. You're dumb. I'm not wrong. You don't understand, Maya droned as she looked up from the canvas and out at whatever she was drawing. Oh, no. I get it. When you say contrarian, you just mean argumentative. Straw man. It's at this point that I'm like, she very well may be just a sleeper agent of some kind. I don't know. I don't know that this book's characterization is quite a bit, like, it's quite messy. We go from they're super into each other to arguing to being super into each other. Also, his using Maya droned makes me question the complimenting of her as an obsession that he was just doing, and now he is so annoyed. Again, there's just no chemistry here, and I'm not sure what it's going for. As he gets upset, she says, quote, count to 10. My point exactly. You forgot the interaction. We're not robots because we can be trained, and we're not so different, though we have our own wants. But the moment our potential encounters the world, that's art. I guarantee that we are as smart as each other, Jean, but where you go on instinct, I reject it all. You will never know how to draw because you will not try. You think that you're above it, but you submit yourself to the prerequisite. If you know the truth about yourself, how you are made, how you are, it's not that difficult to find the fulcrum to turn it upside down. But why? Just for the hell of it? Unlike the other book that had more of the characters like doing things, this book feels much more explainy in an argumentative slash thesis way, not in a character way. Like, a lot of the characters sound much more similar to one another than they did in the other books. Actually, Dark Scientist ended up with the characters sounding a lot alike because they all swore a lot in the exact same way. But it's at this point that I'm not really understanding how any of this is supposed to click together, what exactly Maya is arguing for, other than she obviously feels like she is connected to whoever is in charge of this experiment and is kind of guiding Jean one way or another, whether it is against what they're hoping will happen to him. It also makes me feel like she is related to Lastra somehow in some way, that he is an experiment and she's evaluating him, especially because of the way that she is talking to him. They exchange information about their parents slash upbringing. She says that she has the devil for a father and Jean wants to beat down anybody for mistreating her. Quote, "I'd kick his ass," Jean said, and Maya smiled for real. "No, he'd put you in a cage if you let him." "Maybe he is the devil," Jean said, contemplating the cage. "That sounds like hell. Anyone tries to put me in a cage, I'll kill him." "Treat your mice better," she said, with a tremble in her voice, so vulnerable, so noticeable, it may as well have been a slap across Jean's face. "We're not mice," he said. "Yes, we are." Switch to a new perspective named Victor, said to be Maya's brother, an introduction saying that his future is already determined for him. Everything is laid out. We're introduced also immediately to his having feelings for his sister, kissed her once and she rejected him. She's on the phone with him now, informing him that Jerome's existence is causing trouble for Jean's therapist and is helping him put things together. She demands that he fix this because if the therapist can find birth certificates for Jerome, then he can definitely find them for Jean, and then he will know the truth, and that'll kill him. Victor taunts her about her having chosen the lesser version of himself by liking Jean, and she is like, "Jean is better than you will ever be. Victor, shut up." I don't understand why she thinks this, because why she is defending him when it doesn't feel like they've even developed a relationship yet, other than she might use that against Victor because she doesn't like Victor and she knows that it will bother him. Victor ultimately agrees to do something to combat the fact that the jig is coming up, that there is danger in the situation for corruption of the experiment. Back to Jean, there is a girl named Riley from a party that he has been at one time, comes to his door, and she gets like really close and is offering to write his ethics paper for him if she can have one of his glowing rats. He doesn't say no. He later brings a pair of blue rats to this girl to give them to her. She's with her friend in the library, and they both flirt with him as the deal is going down. The girls say that obviously he's a nice guy or he wouldn't be doing this in the first place, and to prove them wrong, he smashes one of the mice under a book. And the girls scream, and he's like, "It's fine, here's another one." And they're like, no, I wanted that one." And he's like, "They're clones. They're literally the same thing." They're like, "You're a freak, okay?" And then they leave. This is just telling me that he should have snapped Nero's neck way back when, because that would have also started to show this sort of character and brutality. Switch over to Jerome's POV, and he gives his prostitute lady friend that he sees all the time his jag, and also his mother's necklace, the last thing that he has that belongs to his mother. So clearly this woman is some kind of important to him, though we don't really know why, we don't really know how. She isn't really featured heavily in this, she's just kind of around. I don't know, I don't get Jerome's whole side story going on. Anyway, they're supposed to go to a fancy restaurant to have like their last date, but she convinces him to stay home so that they can make a cake together, and they flirt in the kitchen and they see each other in ways that they hadn't seen each other before. Jerome admits to being sad, and the woman kisses him as she has major feelings for him and has said so throughout this entire scene. She says that she wants to have a child and implies that she would have one with Jerome if he would just do it. Quote, "I had a chance, and now I wish that I could do it all over again. With Jean, it's too late." "Hey, nothing's ever too late. I'm a coward," he confessed, staring into the oven. "What are we if we lost all our chances of being who we could be?" "That's not how the world works," she said, the little smile in her voice as if to chastise him as a foolish little boy, too serious for his own good. "What are we then?" She looked over at him, taking his chin and making him face her beside him. We're only the moment. We can only change an instant. We can only ever become strangers to ourselves. So, who are you, Mr. London? This felt really on the nose as to, like, again, push Jerome to go in a specific direction to justify why he is doing things the way that he is doing them. And I think this story would do better, again, sticking to fewer POVs and then having the characters have to explain themselves to show why they did what they did and it not be, like, magical hand moving. Jean then meets with Mr. Oates, who accuses him of plagiarizing his paper because it's exactly like something that was written by a man named Theo Herod over 20 years ago. The only difference being a British terminology here and there. He says that he is going to have to be expelled for this. Meanwhile, Jean swears that he did not plagiarize that paper. He is also captivated by the fact that there is some dude who wrote a paper who thinks exactly like him somewhere, and maybe there is somebody in the world who actually understands him. He leaves the meeting with Oates and gets chased down by his roommate Augustus and some of that guy's bros because they came to beat him up for freaking those girls out in the library and what he did with the rat. I know, so random. This is the last time Augustus shows up. I don't understand this character. While the storm rolls in, Gina's still impressed that there is somebody out there that thinks just like him, and he has decided that he wants to go and find that guy. I kind of feel like this paper should have been like a bigger deal, and we should know what it is that is going to be this life-changing thing, and where the frick did Maya go, because she is suddenly gone. Back to Jerome's POV, he wakes up pissed off about his feelings that he had for the prostitute. She is still there. So he goes on a wrecking spree of destroying the house until he finds a backup plan, and he goes about wrecking the place to find a backup plan that he has, and he says things to hurt this woman before he leaves her in the bed alone. Returning to Victor's POV, he was having dreams about getting his dad's approval so hard that he got up to go and sleep with his dad in the royal way. Son, this isn't Nova Scotia. We don't do that here. Speaking of which, I recently watched a video about the Gorham family from Nova Scotia, Golan family from Nova Scotia. And in the comments, there was somebody saying how there are a lot of hills and mountains in Nova Scotia that are just like incest mountains. And that got me thinking how you could have a show about the Nova Scotia incest mountains, or about these people that are all clones of the same thing, and call it One Tree Hill, because it's all from one family tree. I don't know. That was my aside. Here we go. Anyway, moving on. The bro is super jealous of his sister. You know, Victor is super jealous of his sister Maya, who is out in the world, and he is not. He's never been allowed to have the freedom that Maya has, because he is supposed to be the one to come up behind dear old dad, which, you know, he wants dad's approval, but also he's jealous of his sister getting freedom instead of being the favorite. He goes into his dad's room in the middle of the night to tell him that Maya called, saying that Jean is ruining the control group of the experiment. Dad is not listening. Odd for Dad to not give a shit about this experiment that is apparently a derivative from him, whether it is Victor's experiment or Theo's. Dad should care, because this is still related to Dad. Victor just does whatever Dad says, and there is a usual protocol to take out the problem. But he doesn't do that either, and instead he asks for the man's hand when he lays down beside Daddy. Daddy is already asleep, though, having barely responded to Victor in the first place when Victor came in and started asking questions. Over to Jean's POV, he leaves the glowing mice in the library for someone else to adopt, because he's pretty much just checking out of all of this, pretty much just done doing things. Quote, he had since understood after Riley, Maya's trick, making them different made them something more. It gave them a piece that would be missing otherwise. But what piece? What does that even mean in this context? Use your words, Jean. Explain. I know that you have them. Jean is packing up to leave the school, doesn't want to be here anymore, and is going to chase after wherever Theo is in New York doing his presentation, because Jean started doing research on who Theo Herod was and where he was going to be. And apparently, this guy is conveniently going to be in New York giving a speech in a public place, and so Jean is going to freaking be there. And yes, Theo Herod is also the same last name as Maya Herod, as we know. And also, yes, we have the name Theo was mentioned in the previous section with Victor. When Victor was climbing in the bed, there was the narration said Theo's name right before Theo was introduced in the next chapter. So that literally was unnatural, and it just felt like it was in there to inform the readers and was not a stylistic choice of the narration. Because she said Theo, he's suspicious and demands... Bless you. Because she said so, and when Maya learns about this, she tries to stop Jean from going to New York to see Theo. And since she says the name Theo, he gets suspicious and demands that she tell him how she knows Theo. And he says, quote, "This is why you're here. No matter what, I'll be the victor. I'll make time stop, and there won't be just me. My clones, they won't be unique. They won't have souls. They will be exactly what I am, what I make them. They won't be contrarians or religious. They won't have a choice or free will. They will be perfect. And either you're with me or you're not." And I guess Lastra is helping him because Lastra is also a clone or related to clones, or I don't know. Lastra's involved in this somehow, and I still don't know how that is. Because he's got the same scar on his hand, which implied that it was related to what he's got, and Theo's got it as well. Why doesn't Lastra just tell him the truth? What does he know? But then Theo was talking about taking out Lastra, so I don't actually know how Lastra knows anything. And maybe if Theo is a derivative that is given by Lastra, created by Lastra, but Theo doesn't know that he is a derivative because obviously Jean doesn't know that he's a derivative. So we're missing some pieces. To add to the comment that I just made, he was even holding her by the throat when he was yelling at her. Maya, you know, the girl that he said he was obsessed with, this girl that he said that he got all these feelings for. He was holding her by the throat as he was yelling at her. And we get, quote, "Then he smiled at her and kissed her hard until she was pushing and pounding at his chest to get free. When she did, she fell to the floor in gasps, and Jean walked out." There was no build up to this. There was no build up to their relationship, nothing, and then he walks out. And I don't understand how we got to that kiss either, because the characters' relationships weren't there. Who is Maya a derivative of? Look, if she cannot be a derivative of the original creature unless it is just a version of self-love, which is why he is obsessed with himself. And he's like, you know what? I got feelings for this chick immediately because she is me and I love me. We could do that. Okay, we could definitely do that, but that's not explained in any sort of way. Lastra, we then get a Lastra and Chambers scene where they are rolling around in bed together, bickering and flirting when Jean is at the door. The scene with Lastra and Chambers also feels over the top just to show that they're in a relationship before it gets interrupted because it has no purpose in the story. So then in this scene, it is just Jean coming up to the door telling Lastra that he's not going to need his help anymore, that he doesn't need to talk to them anymore, and that he is going to go and live his life. And Lastra is like, all right, cool, great, awesome, thanks, good luck, kiddo. And then when the kid leaves, he's like, that wasn't Jean. That wasn't Jean at all. That's because it's actually Victor. Returning to Jean's POV, he's now at the clubhouse to see Theo in New York. Quote, "When an initial bumping of shoulders or a spitfire of lost souls colliding, Jean would get the man to like him, to guide him, because the alternative would be impossible. Jean had made 3 wishes, and he had already met Maya. Now he just needed that one missing piece, feeling in his soul that Theo would grant it to him. Then he would create himself anew and stop time forever." I think that we should have seen him obsessing a little bit more over this character to like get him really into it before it also being immediately resolved with him being like, I'm gonna go to this ASAP. And he is fortunately just right there, like not even out of arm's reach. Not even out of arm's reach. And maybe that's just lucky coincidence of where Jean was placed, but again, I don't feel like the setup was created. It's all just because of finding a paper. This all has happened so quickly with just him finding somebody who had written a paper exactly like he did, but with no character development or obsession or memories or faking of memories or like looking into this person because he could have Googled this person and seen a little bit more about him, but there was just nothing about Theo and Theo's background. Even going, oh, he's into genetics. Oh, what is he known for? Like anything. Jean finally sees the man, Theo, and he is very cold. He recognizes the man immediately as the one that he saw in the mirror of his dream that he had forever ago. He also realizes that he is not the creator, but rather the created. This is the moment that he has kind of a flash of, oh my gosh, oh my goodness. The memory that he had of being with Lastra and doing that spooky stuff, he'd succeeded in creating clones, and he was one of them. That memory wasn't his, but of his creator's source. And he just knows of it. So he just has kind of followed on. Kind of makes me think of Soma, where they did a duplicate. If you ever played that video game, Soma, and that was about consciousness, and you had moments in that game where you would transfer your consciousness from one to another, basically creating clones within these bodies. But the one that would transfer to the other thought that it was the original because it would remember the last thing that happened. But it's really a duplicate consciousness. And so the original consciousness is left behind, continuing from there, while the new consciousness thinks, oh, that thing was a success. That's what this feels like. Now, he feels like a rat and hopes that the creator will be merciful, as he knows that he was not a merciful creator, which makes you be like, yeah, so you're probably not going to get mercy because you yourself know that you were not merciful. So he also is not. He says this must be why Maya was saying to be merciful. And she is also a clone of some kind, though a clone of who? Is it also a clone of Theo or Theo's source? If Theo is also a clone, we don't know. But Maya, he did make comments like, would Maya look like me or be like me if she were male? So it gives the indication, and also her being Victor's sister. So that gives the indication that she is a female clone of the same source. Theo tells security that they're going to go home and they're taking Jean with them. He promptly is knocked out. He wakes up in a car, fights off the two dudes with his legs and some assault vomiting. Then he climbs out the window with his hands zip tied and starts running down the street. Now this is where we start getting into like comedy zone, because this is so ridiculous, especially. So it's 75% of the way there. He fights off these guys by projectile vomiting and kicking them, climbs out the open window that is somehow opened. Once he gets out, the baddies in the car follow him out of the car. And then there are these other people in the streets of New York. And he's like, those guys are trying to get him. They're trying to kidnap this child. Fight him. So then you've got all of these like random people in this neighborhood coming together to fight off these two bodyguards. And also, where the frick is Theo? Was he not in the same car as Theo? And also, why wasn't Jean thrown in the trunk of the car? Anyway, so this whole group of people come together to try to fight off these guys, as they're saying those guys are trying to kidnap this kid. Where are the police? There's nobody in here trying to call the police. Meanwhile, as these groups are like, we're going to take care of you. Don't worry. We'll watch out for you. Jean is like, no, I got to run away. Even though these people will keep him safe technically from those guys, Jean wants to run away and be alone. Somehow, Jean is super athletic now, outrunning all of the guards and the cops, jumping over subway train platforms, vaulting, jumping onto moving trains, and whatnot to get his escape. And yes, he does escape his pursuers. Going over to Jerome's perspective, he is drinking at the airport, missing his flights again and again and again because he doesn't really want to leave, but he doesn't have any chutzpah in himself to do anything. He calls the hooker that he had a relationship with randomly and says he needs her help. He made a mistake, and his name is not Jerome, it's Hank. Going back over to Jean, now that he has opened the USB, and I don't even know when he opened the USB or when he decided that he knew the correct password for it, but he decided that the password was Theo, and now he has been in it. He is in the City Hall station that is in the underground subway. There's a message on this USB that is from Jerome explaining everything and who Jerome is and what he was hired to do. Quote, if you're reading this, you figured it out. Theo Herod cloned you at the first series of a genetic experiment. You were to be the control, to see what was nature or nurture. There is no point explaining the rest, and I'm sure that you already know. If you can run, do it fast. You're not likely to live if the experiment is compromised, and if you're reading this, it's too late. There's a safety deposit box for you in the White's plane with what you need to start over. I will send you an unconnected contact of whoever is closest to you to take you there. Don't use your credit cards and throw away your phone as soon as you get picked up. The files below are for your new ID and the security questions to get you into the box without a key. Then you'll get a new passport, records, and funds. I may not be Jerome, not anything but a con man, but who picked up the wrong mark. But I was your godfather for a time, for what it was worth. So this character doesn't even need to pretend that he needs the motivation to protect Jean, because he'd already put in this USB protections for him theoretically, and then just checked out because it was like the job was over and it was also dangerous. But it's not like he never showed the care of the outcome of this somehow, but also it's very confusing. I don't really understand how these options came together. And like, he feels bad, obviously. He's sitting there drinking, being like, I should have done something. I should have done something. I don't know why he didn't, because we also didn't get a sense of the danger of like what Theo was doing or whoever was in charge of the whole thing going on and how closely he was being watched. But we also didn't get a sense of like Jerome actually caring, because Jerome was a lush this whole time, and maybe he was depressed because he was part of this experiment and he knew better. But like, he also obviously didn't care to be a parent to Jean, unless he was ordered to be a shitty parent. But you don't have to take drugs at home and be a lush. I don't know. I don't know. And like, also, why would you give him in this nature versus nurture situation? Why would you give him all of the money and then a shitty parent when this is about nature versus nurture? I just don't understand. And then it got me going. So did Jerome fake his own death, or did they just forget that he was being used? Like, why wouldn't Theo have killed that dead end that would spoil what he was doing? There is so much going on here that I don't feel like was actually considered in how these characters interact with one another or what their goals are. Like, look at what Theo was willing to do to capture Jean, and he didn't have an assassin ready to freaking murder Jerome when he was done with Jerome, especially since Jerome is nobody important. In that exact moment, Jean also gets a text message from Jerome saying to call this number and give your location. That's it. He eventually is found by a cop who is walking around down there and making his way to the surface from the train station. He pretends that he doesn't speak English, talking in German, and then makes a run for it as soon as he can. Outside, Jerome's prostitute girlfriend is waiting in her inherited Jag that Jerome had given her. Jean gets in. There is this high-speed race between her and the henchman, and she gets away from everyone, and then they are crashed into hardcore spinning and everything. It is comical. I was very, like, we're at like 80%, 85%. This is the culmination. I'm like, what? Where are we? Now we're in Victor's POV. Yeah, so Victor was the one to visit Lastra, obviously pretending to be Jean because they're clones. They look the same. Apparently, they look all the same. And Lastra is not a clone and not working in part of this because the kid thought that he could fool Lastra. But then again, that could just be Theo also not knowing that Lastra is the game master in charge of all this. We don't really know. Father here tells Victor that he has brought Jean in, and so then he's going to be missing some parts because there was an accident, but he did successfully engineer his personality, and they have the ability to grow the body parts to help fix Jean up, so they are going to do that. But he must leave Maya alone. Bro, the age difference. Victor feels like he is literally 5 years old from the way that he is acting and interacting with others when he is supposed to be the same. He is like groveling and sniveling and saying daddy and wanting to hold his hand, and I don't get this character. They are very infantilized. Jean is strapped to a metal table, and then Victor is taunting him, comically to the level of taunts and tortures, and asks if Jean has done it yet with Maya, because that's all apparently Bro cares about over here. He's licking the blood off Jean's damaged stump arm while being like, you done it with her? With our sister? Jean has no questions about where he is, who he is, why this guy looks like him. There is no pause for him to like look around, be like, who are you? What is this? Why do you look like me? And you would think that there would be something, some sort of reaction, but no, there's nothing. And there's a complete disconnect from the character in the situation. Quote, as Victor fished for some metallic instrument around in the darkened space, rummaging through the clinking features to a right tool, Jean realized that even the one girl that he had ever loved was just another way for him to love himself. So he doesn't even need any answers to know that he is, that all of these are clones. I guess he had his realization earlier, but it's just, he's not even in pain. He's not even anything. As Victor fixes Jean up and cuts through him a la Frankenstein, coming into this with stem cells to break things apart and then create body parts, he also kisses Jean. And then later he says, quote, even when they had kissed, Victor felt like it was not the first time for Jean the way that it had been for him. and he considered perhaps that he was left out of a great adventure that Jean was permitted to go on. Free will wasn't something real, not in Victor's context, or any he concluded for that matter. Surely it was a figment like a ghost, or the idea of one in the air and long enough forgotten battleground, and though he didn't believe in such things, it felt, just being in Jean's presence, that he had touched the edges of such supernatural things. So he says, like, Jean has kissed people, but he has never kissed people, but it says that he had kissed Maya before. But I don't know what this story has forgotten versus who is an unreliable character. So Jean is fixed up and put on a speeding train room to finish healing. From Jean's perspective, he's laying in bed, weak, he can't move his replacement arm like he would, and he is thinking about his own life and choices now. Quote, "And while looking at it, he lamented what he had told Oates, that I can fix your leg, chop it off, grow another." Jean swallowed his tears, telling himself that he had no ownership over even those. This was his doing, his terrible, inevitable doing, and he was glad that Theo had not come to see. He had never gone to his own mice, even for loneliness. That would be pathetic. He only attended to them for their sake of his own sick curiosities. Looking back down at his arm, he told himself that he would not use it no matter how well it grew to work. It had an essence to it, unseen and unknown, that defied nature. This art, only now that it was cast over him, did Jean realize was savagely uncanny. Maya had told him what her father would do, and he had said that he had killed the man who put him in a cage, but now he thought it wasn't so easy. He couldn't bring himself to feel deserving of anything anymore, so he did nothing but feel the weight of his body falling into entropy, decaying with the passing of each day. Jean is being cared for by Victor, who is getting bored. One day, he eventually asks why Dad doesn't like him, and Jean says that maybe he has just spent too much time with her. I think I'm just too dumb. Maybe I've checked out at this point, but like, Victor kicks the frick out of Jean and then leaves for him saying that. Victor is obviously frustrated with his own existence and not getting Daddy's attention, and Jean is a nobody, and nobody, like, Dad doesn't even care about Jean, so there's nothing for him to be jealous of either. Jerome's POV, he's surprised that things have fallen apart so quickly, but he is the one that set this up. He set it up knowing that it would end quickly. He put it in his note that things were going to end very quickly, and maybe that should have shown in how depressed he was with the coming 18th birthday, and like, it was suddenly becoming real that this deal where this kid was going to disappear, or no, because the kid didn't even have to disappear. He didn't even have to disappear from the kid's life. They could have made something up. I'm so confused what the deal was here with Theo and Jerome. So Jerome's wandering around the streets and runs into Dr. Lastra, though he doesn't recognize him at first. They grab a coffee together, and Jerome gets a call from Theo asking him where he is, basically threatening him, and he's like, well, I'm on a flight out of town. Goodbye. You would have thought that the hire to kill would have come a lot sooner than this. And it turns out that Lastra only showed up in order to give Jerome a push in the correct direction and also to encourage him. Quote, "It's decision time," he said. "You were a part of this, so don't act like you can just walk away from it now. You know where he is. I know you know." Jerome thought to just get up and walk out, to tell the loon to bugger off again, but Lastra seemed to read his mind once more, and he smiled and said, "Listen to me, Hank. We're both con men in our own ways. You aren't really a posh brat, and I don't help people for the good of it. We both like to toy with people. You realize that you are good at something, and that if you're just grading enough, you can get what you want when you want it. You can whine and bitch to anyone in this coffee shop and get their spoils, and you're probably smarter than them too, but not me. I can see you. As much as you think, it won't keep you from knowing the right thing to do. Not right in the boring moral sense, but knowing what Hank would do. He loves that boy, and you know deep down what will happen if you leave now. You're stronger than you think, and it only takes a moment's choice. It's too late," Jerome said. "Yeah, it is," Lastra said, standing fully and taking his notebook. "It's too late. But it isn't over. Who are you going to be?" He says this right after saying that he likes messing with people for fun. Switching over to Maya's perspective randomly, just to show how disappointed and sad she is that Gina's not there, and then continue with this weird incest self-cessed quote. Often, since childhood, she considered how much her own temperament and his would collide, and now she had found herself equal parts relieved and disappointed that their only shared manifestation was the school they had selected. It was during her initial forays into contrarianism and stoicism that she chose mascot, feeling the grim irony of knowing it was Theo's choice as well. She knew, though, how lucky she was to be left alone. Perhaps it was because he had made her female, or perhaps because he just had nothing else to compare her to. But being made as she was and abandoned the same for it, she felt just unique enough to have a right to exist on her own. I don't understand what his goal was with her. Like, why make a female and then abandon and stop caring? Why? What was the point of Jean? I get that this is trying to do a nature versus nurture and using clones to be like, are they their own consciousness? But I don't feel like the story actually lets you follow that question. Victor calls her to tell her to come home because Jean was now there with him and she belongs at home as well. Is that such a good idea when Dad has abandoned her? Like, what is the situation around her and Dad? He uses Jean to taunt her as bait, and she knows that she has to go because she has the one piece that they're all missing. Did she get therapy too? And was she told that she was missing a piece? What is this missing piece? Is it just because she's a female? Like, what is the missing piece? Because all of these guys act differently. They might have an interest in the sciences that they're doing in this experiment, but I don't see any of them as having the same personality. Meanwhile, Jerome breaks into a bank to get his own security deposit box and withdraw a gun. Yeah, there were no alarms, there were no guards, there were no cops. He just breaks in and takes his stuff and leaves. Victor's POV, this is where we learn that he is 16. Why does he read like he is 7 years old, especially if he is the successful one that Daddy favors as his predecessor? Quote, Victor flinched, looking back at the other end of the table, then to his father, feeling his cheeks well up. There's a difference branded him again with an uncanny terror. When he turned back to his plate, he heard Father's silverware clank. What's going on? Nothing, Victor said. You seem tired, guilty or something. Victor's chest tightened, but he didn't want to show it. Was he guilty? He didn't know. But if Father did, then he must have been. As Victor kept his gaze away and filled up his plate, he could feel Father standing close. Then he touched him across the neck with a cold prong of his fork, and Victor froze. Oh yeah, this is just Victor and his dad sitting at a dinner somewhere. And they're bickering back and forth because a 16-year-old isn't equal to a 40-year-old creator-master. Quote, we're partners when we're equals. You said I am you. In the flesh. Victor breathed hard, feeling his face flash with tears ready to erupt. If I'm not perfect, it's your fault. Theo put down a fork and folded his hands, turning to face Victor and giving a bored stare as he listened. I wouldn't be living if it weren't for you. Don't you see my loyalty? I want Maya because she is you. That was your mistake. Oh, and how often you make it. It is the only thing that I cannot understand about you, Victor. The perversion that you have to yourself. Should I have let you compete with Jean for your title? Perhaps, but I chose you, and you must take that juvenile energy and put it to work. This comes after Theo has already criticized him for not getting Jean to do what he wants. So I don't really know why Dad here prefers Victor when Victor clearly is not up to the standard that he was hoping that he would be. This is also where we learned that Victor raped Jean at some point off screen when they were in his lab. Quote, you want to play with its eyeballs? Just get the arm working first. Just keep the cameras on, he said, and went back to his food. Victor froze, understanding now that even when Father had no such perversion in him, he could see right through his creation. Cameras on. Well, that part's too late. As the words escaped Victor's lips, he wanted them to crawl back in. A kiss was playing. But now he had revealed exactly what he had done. Of course he had. It couldn't take him a week to build up to such an act. No, he had raped Jean in a matter of days. Where is this coming from? And why is all of this stuff just randomly happening? Like, what did Dad expect from this? What did Theo expect from this? And that's something that is majorly missing from this, is like, what was the expectation for any of these characters? And Victor feels so random. Maya feels so random. Theo, who is supposed to be overseeing this experiment and is somehow disappointed in Victor for his inabilities to do whatever, is not overseeing any of the clones. And I don't understand what the goal is, especially when this was, well, nature versus nurture. Okay, but who are you watching? Nobody is watching over this. So who cares? What is the investment for Victor or for Jean? Jean is over here just commiserating about being one of the rats, the way that he had treated the rats. and how love was for people like Jerome and Maya, but not for him. How he sees Maya as a person when she is also a clone. I don't know where that part is coming from. Sure, he can do it, but we're not getting justification of how he's seeing himself as separate from Maya when he also recognizes that she is a clone of him. More torture, more taunting with this dude before Jerome randomly shows up coming into the house because he knows where he is, or just with his gun. Is all that we got. And he got through without any security, without any locks that he had to break, without any passcodes that he had to get through where they're doing human experimentation. He just got in there. Victor sets Jean free. Jean beats Victor to death and then cries when we get to the line, quote, "He sobbed into the mess of flesh, hair, and bone. His flesh, his hair, and his bone. Only now at the end of it did he feel like he had killed his brother, because now he felt alone." Which is really stupid, because did he have a relationship with Victor where he didn't feel alone? We never got to establish how he didn't feel alone. Since the very beginning of this book, he felt alone, which is why he tried to kill himself. At least it was one of his rationalizations for killing himself. So what does it mean he now feels alone? We never developed that. My one wish for Victor would have been Victor saying, "Go fuck yourself," while they fought, and then Jean going, "You already did. Remember?" and then kills him. Anyway, Jean is already dying, thinks of himself as a monster, so he's going to stay behind and meet Theo and hopefully burn the place down. Jerome and Jean exchange "I love yous," saying, "You're not really that bad." Jerome gives Jean his gun and is like, "You know how to use it, don't you?" I don't know. Jean is going to know how to use it and just go and use it for real. This dude been playing video games with cheat codes at this point. So Jerome just sees himself out. Jean sneaks into the house to get to Theo's room, where again, Theo is sleeping. Again, no guards. He's not awake. He hasn't heard any of the noise. He's not even watching the cameras to see what the frick Victor was up to after what happened at dinner time. And of course, then Jean kills. As Jean is leaving, he also lights the house on fire. And then Jean is leaving the house. I would have figured that Jean would have stayed dead there and just let everything go up in flames, including himself. But that's not the resting place that he wants. He gets outside of the house as it is burning, and Maya is coming up, and so then they walk off together. He tells her to go and have a good life and that there isn't that opportunity for him. And final chapter is he goes to the college campus, meets with Dean Oates in his office, and kills himself. Quote, "Don't do this," Oates said, the terror finally showing in his chest, heaving and his eyes welling with tears. "God made you for a reason, Jean." And Jean said, "God didn't make me." He squeezed and his skull opened, taking the bullet clean through like a meteor through the ill-fated planet. Time finally stopped for Jean Morrow. And that is the story of this book. Now, I left a lot of stuff out. I highly recommend you read it if you're interested in seeing it for yourself, because I also think that you will pick up things that I did not get. But I am also just like, what? Maybe you can see why I feel like I'm gaslit on this book, because I'm like, I don't understand. There's so much I don't understand the choices of this book. But also the lack of security at the dude's mansion. I want some answers. Anyway, to say that I was disappointed in this book would be a bit of an understatement, but I think that there are a lot of interesting ideas in this book. I just don't think that they connected. I personally don't see them connecting. Maybe you'll see connections in them and you'll be able to tell me what you see in the comments that I missed. But getting into my final comments sections, the characters in this novel were very weak to me. I don't think that I can even call them characters, where I could call Catherine and Robert and even Seymour in Dark Scientist as characters, as they had ambitions and motives and personalities. I could not say the same thing about this book. Every character in this felt like they changed from page to page based on what the story wanted to say or the theme at the moment. Where I mentioned in the previous book, characters felt like functions, some of them did in this, if not most of them did in this. Starting with Jean, he's somewhere between 16 and 18 at different points in this book. He acts like he is between 12 and 14. He could be a little younger in some places. But in the opening chapters, he especially feels young. And then he goes from being this bratty, demanding child to an egotist who wants control to a ninja badass. He doesn't seem thrown off by anything that is thrown his way. He doesn't really have an existential crisis. He doesn't get obsessive like you think that he would, because his originator got obsessive about curing his time loss. And then also for somebody as paranoid and as passionate as Theo theoretically is, as theoretically Jean is, like you would think there's such a good chance to do like mirroring of the same personality traits but in different ways between these guys and like the positions that they occupy, and we don't get to see any of that. We don't get to see how much they are similar versus not. It's just the only thing that we see is we are told that they wrote the same paper and they have the same interest, but like we don't get to see them actually interacting. And that would be so incredibly interesting and eerie to see them interacting that way. Even Oates in an earlier scene when he was being interviewed for the school, it would have been interesting to see if like Oates thought this kid had very similar attributions, had very similar characterisms as Theo Herod. And maybe Oates could have been like, do you know a man named Theo Herod? Because he's already associating with him and being like, are you copying him or something? And like plant the seeds throughout to build those similarities that are just natural that he doesn't know. And why did he attempt suicide in the first chapter? I don't know. We have multiple different strings in which we could cling to for like why that was happening. Was it Jerome's attention or lack of attention? I don't know, because he didn't really do anything after that in order to bring Jerome back to him if he wanted the attention. He didn't seem particularly close to Jerome, but also at points he said, I love you, and he acted like he had deeper feelings for Jerome in a weird way. And to make it worse, in the opening of this book, he's suicidal for no obvious reason, and then he discovers that he's a clone, and he is still not really... Oh, and then he is still suicidal? So, like, that's the thing that flips the switch. Was the previous in the opening scene a different Jean? Did that one actually die? It could be, actually. You know, let's do this. Let's assume that the Jean in the opening scene was a clone that died, and then new Jean that went to therapy had the memories of the suicide attempt. I don't know if it's the same consciousness. That's just a possibility. We're just throwing that out there for the conversation's sake at this point. Also makes you wonder how much of the environment was controlled, but we never really saw where Theo's hands were or how much he was involved in this, where he was also saying, Victor, you're in charge of this, but also it's his experiment. So like, but for what? For whose purpose? Was it his nature versus nurture experiment? Then why wasn't he watching it closer? I don't really know. Speaking of controlled environment, what did Theo even hire Jerome to do for his part in this study? Because no one in this freaking monitored the situation, and you got him in this house of rich people with the worst person watching over him you could, and you would think that there would still be cameras in the house watching to make sure Jerome did what he was supposed to do, even if he was a con man. But no one was watching the control group. You'd have a better control subject by literally just allowing some random people to adopt him as an infant and not hire a con man to raise him in Richie Richville. There's literally nothing about Theo that tells us who he is beyond egotistical, and for someone as powerful and egotistical as him, he's walking around with bodyguards, but his house is oddly empty to make it easy for an 18-year-old going 12 to kill him in his bed and never be alerted to it. Speaking of conmen, let's talk about Jerome. Jerome goes from being over-the-top rude all the time to lushy to caring and saying, I love you in the end, when these people didn't even spend any time around each other. We never saw anyone gain affection for anyone else or for any reason, so why should he suddenly care? Him saying that he spent 18 years of his life around this kid isn't good enough to then explain why he was neglectful and absent all of the entire time just to come back at the end here to care. Dr. Lastra was literally just a plot device. At least he just felt like a plot device. He could have been more, and I think he's the one that I could have missed more on, but his involvement with the like make 3 wishes and see what they are doesn't make sense aside unless we're talking about Kid Jean running into Lastra, and then when he makes those preferences known to Dr. Lastra, then Dr. Lastra genetically manipulates and tests on Jean, which creates Theo, which then also creates Jean later, because Jean is another clone of original Jean. You see what I'm saying here? What is Dr. Lastra doing? I don't know. But he does show up just to push things, to push buttons, to talk, and Maya does the exact same thing. Augustus was window dressing, just like Nero. They were basically the exact same thing. Has nothing to do with anything. Oates also was a plot device, if not window dressing. I don't know what the point of his POV was either. Overall, I think that Gene should have been younger at the very least, but you could have also made him be 18 or be in college and make this work too. I just think that it wasn't necessarily as focused as it needed to be to explore this topic, and the characters weren't delved into when the idea of nature versus nurture is very much a character-focused plot line. Setting. We've got the school, we've got the doctor's office for a little bit, and if it was going to be a major part of the story, we probably needed to explore more of what the school was, what it looked like, the controlled environment, how much Theo's fingers were in that environment. Was Oates connected to Theo in any way or connected to Lastra? It felt like very specific that it was Oates that was always overseeing for Gene. So I feel like he should have been connected to either Theo or Lastra or Chambers in some way. There just, aside from that, there wasn't really any setting. It didn't really describe anywhere that it spent any time. The alchemy, as I said before, wasn't really used in this, and I don't really understand how or why Lauren Chambers, the character, brought up alchemy or gave the kid alchemy books, or why Gene suddenly went into alchemy books. I think that could have been a larger part if he was going to do the pursuing of immortality through that, but we don't really see it. And then it made Lastra's magic part even more confusing. Now I'm going to talk about agency. Like the other books, this book lacks character agency. The characters don't make decisions for themselves or respond independently to their surroundings. They're just kind of feeling like finger puppets for the author with no response whatsoever to the situations that they are in. Anything, even friggin' Theo the inbred with a gun to his head, doesn't have a response to freaking Gene about to kill him. Narration. The narrative voice of this book in general is close third, and it changes depending on who it feels like following at the time, but it also head hops, so it's not super consistent. On top of that, it feels like it purposefully hides information from the reader in order to create suspense, rather than telling you what the character is thinking or looking at it when they should know. Suspense isn't created by pushing the reader out of the story. It comes by inviting them in and showing us the stakes and letting us worry about the characters and being invested in the characters and the outcome. It did this more than once with multiple characters, which is what irritated me especially. It also switched perspectives just to tell the reader what to think or to see things that they otherwise wouldn't see in ways that really didn't add anything and in ways that just felt like telling, like having Oates tell you exactly how you're supposed to be looking at Gene instead of just letting Gene act like a freak and not realize that everyone act around him, and then that room gets warmed up and you guys say go to hell and you're like, whoa. On that note, I think that this story did itself a disservice by switching between also so many characters. By the time we randomly hit to Maya's POV way later in the story, I was like, what are we even doing? It's the same with Lastra. I think that the book could have benefited from keeping it to one or two perspectives. Here is an example switching to Oates' perspective during the interview just to get to tell us what to think. Quote, all pretenses dropped, even a Gene who sneered a smile so demonically vindictive, Oates could easily call him possessed. It just, yeah. Let me know what you think on that. Writing. There are many strange sentences like, quote, Gene felt spasmed to disagree. And exaggerated descriptions like, quote, Riley's friend covered her face with her hands, eyes popping from her skull. These sorts of things make it more comical than horror and do more to get rid of the tension than telling us where we're going. This book also tended to be anemic on descriptions of people or places. It never really set the scene whenever he was somewhere, never went into describing the people that he was with, and never had a sense of place. It's not even like this book was super long. It could have benefited from describing places, creating scenes, and just letting us be with the characters longer and seeing what they see. When it comes to motive, there was never really a clear motive or drive to anyone in this book. I've kind of gone over that already by talking about, like, what is Theo doing? What is Lastra doing? What is Gene doing? Because he keeps switching things. What is Victor doing? Victor's trying to make Daddy happy. What is Maya doing? Why was Maya rude at first? Did she have no interest in talking to Gene because she knew Gene was a clone? Did she want to keep Gene away from her dad? Like, there are so many different things, but there is no motive for anybody, which I think is what ultimately makes this much more confusing. And then you get to the end where he believes himself a monster, but he doesn't believe that Maya is a monster, even though she is the same thing. And we never get to the bottom of what she thinks is special about her. If he thinks that there is something special about her, like, what is it that makes her stand apart that he doesn't think of her as a monster alongside with him and the others? Then you have this whole thing with this complete control. So you got the suicide, the fear of time, the being a monster, the desire of complete complete control and the wanting to be better than everybody and the believing to be better than everybody, and it doesn't come into anything.
Another thing I would like to add to this that I think would have been an interesting direction because I think the existential horror in this situation is very high. Because imagine you're just living your life and you start to realize that one, you don't have control. Two, you run into somebody who looks so much like you that it is creepy, a doppelganger situation. And then you find out that there is absolutely zero control. And imagine also living your entire life feeling like you don't have control of things. And you come to realize that you don't. And I think this book really could have explored this idea of a slow reveal, much slower than this, of just like Gene living his life and possibly even his having killed himself or an attempt to kill himself could have been his trying to have control over something in his life. He doesn't know why. He just has this deep existential feeling that he has no control, and that killing himself would have at least given him a sense of control. And he failed at doing that because he is in a controlled environment, and his scientist, his creator, wasn't ready for him to die yet. And so then from there, he's talking with the doctor, maybe, depends on if the doctor is in on it. Like the whole setup of this to then make it an extremely controlled environment to where Gene would slowly wake up to the fact that he is in an controlled environment and the creepiness, really, of seeing a doppelganger before he knows that he is a clone and putting the pieces together and his obsession with control being this intrinsic feeling that he doesn't understand yet, but it's about getting his own drive, his own ability to do something. And that could also be part of not just nature versus nurture, but like determinism as well. Because if you've got this God hand above you, constantly deciding your own things, where you are also a derivative of another person, and so your desires, your motives, your whatever are from somebody else, with Maya in there trying to encourage him to be something else, because maybe she snuck in and she's not supposed to be there, and it's a bad situation for her to be in. Maybe she was considered defective, or she escaped the situation before and she's trying to help another person that is like her. I don't know, there are so many ways as this could go at, but as I'm thinking about it further, like the existential fear and this obsession with control that would still come from the original Theo, the original Gene, but it would transform into something else as Gene specifically mutates in the situation to need control outside of his creator's control. I think it's a very interesting thing to explore, and I'm disappointed that that's not something that was really explored in this lush environment for exploring that?
Lastra also did not apparently have a motive, unless it was monitoring the situation. Maya and the clones. In general, Maya not only felt random, but like she didn't fit. Was she the only girl clone ever created? Or she just didn't know of the others that came within the 20 years before her, because we know that there are 20 years between Theo's paper being written and then obviously Jean finding that paper, being in here. So, how many groups of clones had there been between Theo completing this university and modern day? When did he move to human cloning? Did anybody else know about this? Was this in the papers anywhere? How many other subjects had there been? Did he hire a nanny to take care of all of his clones, or did he just fling them out into the world to see what would happen? Oh, and that doesn't matter either because he wasn't observing any of them. Was it just Lastra who was observing them as a therapist and that Theo was just another part of this thing? We don't know. At one point, the book said, quote, Maya, the contrarian girl who he had come to love. And that was another thing that we were told, but we weren't actually able to see. And her being a contrarian, also, I don't understand why it got so fixated on calling her a contrarian. Because again, if that's going to be something that her going against Victor and her dad, then she would be hiding from them. And that's another story right there. Like, I see so many threads for this story, but I just don't see them used. And then it leaves me being confused. Maya is part of Jean's background. Maya being part of Jean's background didn't really make sense. It didn't really come to mean anything, but him telling the therapist about her. He didn't think about her even outside of those couple of moments. And he says that she was the most important person, but like, where do we see that? Was that one of the few memories that he actually had for real as a person, or had he tried to make Maya because of that memory? Like, she.
Oh my gosh. So another note. It's possible if we go back to this idea of him living in a completely controlled environment that Maya should not have been in. And then Maya enters his life, and she is like the one thing that super pushes him to do things that he's never done before that don't feel controlled, that get him out of that like loop of predictability and make him feel alive in a way that he never did. It would explain one, the feelings that he has for her, and then two, his pursuit. And then his need for control could also show in how he treats her. Not like trying to be overly controlling, but like when he's got his millions of flowers, the hundreds of flowers that he purchases her and trying to court her into having affections for him because he is trying to create this controlled environment that also goes not just with what is intrinsically part of him because it's part of his creator, but it is also part of the situation in which he has always lived and he doesn't know that. So then he is trying to create a controlled situation that will then guide Maya into being the girl that he wants her to be. And she sees it happening because she lived in that controlled environment herself. And she's constantly like, no, no, let's not. And so then that leads into, him eventually kissing her because he has become so trying to control the situation to get what he wants. And she is like, no, there's so much here. Oh my gosh. I wish it could go there. I wish it went there.
Pacing. The book was not only very slow, but it also felt very janky, like compartmentalized in a way where nothing in the story was really touching each other, where there were multiple ideas going around. And obviously, I've said that in different ways here, and you may have been able to see it with how it's described. But none of them actually really touch, and it often even felt like the characters weren't really talking to each other at times. Something else about this book, especially, I know that these used to be Kindle Vella, which is slash was an episodic thing on Amazon like Wattpad. I don't know if it's still there. This definitely read much more like segments to me than the previous books, and like things were forgotten between phases. Plot. It was all over the place. Jean didn't discover anything. You can tell me if I'm missing something in the story. I'm sure that I absolutely am. The rats. Mentioned at the beginning, including Nero, were only twice, and then there was the glowing rats, but they just felt like a red herring, and they were meant to be like an allegory or a perpendicular metaphor. Is that redundant? So that Gene could like see himself, but I think that if it spent more time, like if the professor who guided Gene and even possibly Victor at the university were their masters and they were the clones, and that was such a enclosed environment that was specifically controlled by the master, then you could have made this work and it could be so creepy, like Truman Show. But we didn't get there, but I wish we did. Starbucks. It gets its own section in this book because Starbucks is mentioned more than a few times, especially because, Jerome likes to drink Starbucks, but every time Starbucks comes up in this book, it has to also make a comment of how shitty it is. It's like, Jerome is drinking this super shitty coffee and he has no idea why, but he loves the shitty coffee. Tell me how you really feel. It felt unnecessary, so much so that I noticed it and put it in the notes, obviously. My random question of this video is, do you think that clones share the same physical issues as incest if they were to have kids? And my final thoughts about Lastra. I think Lastra may be the creator, maybe the godhead in charge of all of this, and Theo is a clone who thinks that he is the original. Going back to the violinist and the curse, it says, I don't know what happened to Lastra, but I know that there are others. And when I say that, it's because in that boiler room, after they make the deal to get what they want, they also can say how they die. And you get all four of them the other three get ways of how they die. With Harry, it says a monster kills him. And in this, it says he doesn't know how Lastra dies, but there are many of him, which makes me believe that Lastra is the godhead of the clones. But you'd have to read it and let me know what you think. We'll see if there are any more suggestions in the others. Interesting that this book didn't feature any of the other characters, whereas the Dark Violinist was featured in Catherine's book, even though it didn't need to be. Again, I still think Catherine should have gone to the Sebastian at the end of the other book when she realized that she was now cursed. That makes more sense than the random escapade that she went on. Anyway, those are my thoughts on this book. Let me know what you think down in the comments below. Have you read this book? Will you read this book? I think there are pieces to put together here. We'll see how the rest of the books read and that, but looking forward to the discussion. With that said, have a great weekend and don't die.
Was that Wayland Cross in the trunk? Do you know, or is that something that's still being figured out?
The person in the trunk was not Wayland Cross. Is he in trouble? We don't know who did it, but as the owner of the car, the longer he's missing, the worse it looks for him.
Cross isn't a killer. For the last couple of years, the average number of murders in Baltimore has been over 300, and it's been going up. Mind you, that's only whatever the badges count as official murder, and believe me, there are people that don't count when they die. Wayland? If you're down here, tell me. I'm not talking to the badges, I've been looking for you. They found a body in your trunk. Why? Did you do that? To the left, plain black letters read along the wall. You walked in the corridor. Once that ends, you chose the dark is on the right. My vision goes blurry, flickers black and black and black for longer intervals until I can't see anything at all. I'm not screaming anymore, but my voice echoes back to me. Where the hell am I? You're dead, Josephine. Even smart people do stupid shit sometimes, right?